Chapter 21. Angus Kilmartin was seated alone at a small table near the fire in White's sombre, overheated dining room when Sebastian walked up and settled in the chair opposite. "I don't recall issuing an invitation for you to join me," said the Scotsman, his voice pleasant, his face never losing its habitual expression of mild amusement. "That's quite all right," said Sebastian. "I don't intend to stay long." Kilmartin grunted and cut himself a slice of beefsteak. Sebastian said, "I hear you've recently been awarded a new contract with the Navy." "Yes." "Congratulations." Kilmartin glanced up at him. "You say that as if you disagree in some way with the procedure." "Why would I?" Just 2 decades before, Angus Kilmartin had been an obscure Glaswegian merchant. Today, there were few lucrative industries in which he was not invested. From his mills in Yorkshire rolled the cloth used to make uniforms for Britain's soldiers and sailors. His foundries supplied them with cannon and firearms, while from his shipyards came an endless supply of the frigates and gunboats that helped Britannia rule the waves. Over the course of 20 years of war, as Britain's artisans and craftsmen starved, and sheep grazed amidst the ruined cottages of displaced Highland clansmen, Angus Kilmartin had prospered far beyond most men's wildest dreams. "Why, indeed," he said, carefully buttering a piece of bread. "Is this why you are here, to discuss my business ventures?" "Actually, I'm curious about how you came to know a French doctor named Damien Peloton." Kilmartin chewed slowly and deliberately before swallowing. "You refer, I take it, to the young man recently set upon by footpads in St. Catherine's." "He was certainly killed in St. Catherine's, although I seriously doubt footpads had anything to do with it." "And what makes you imagine I knew him?" "You were seen arguing with him last Thursday morning in the park. That's the day he was killed, incidentally." Kilmartin only smiled faintly, his chin tucked, his eyes downcast as he worked to cut himself another slice of beef. Sebastian watched him. "So you don't deny it?" The Scotsman paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, his eyes going wide. "Why should I? Peloton was a physician. I consulted with him over a medical matter. I see no reason to furnish you with the particulars." "And you would have me believe you met with him in the park to argue a medical matter?" "I didn't exactly meet with him. I encountered him by chance. We fell into a dispute." "Over a medical matter?" "Yes." "I wonder, how did you come to hear of him? He hadn't been in London long." "Someone recommended him to me. I don't recall now precisely whom." "One of the Bourbons, perhaps?" suggested Sebastian sardonically. Kilmartin gave a faint, tight-lipped smile and shrugged. "Perhaps. Who can say?" Sebastian let his gaze drift around the elegant, high-ceilinged room. "I assume you've heard the rumours." "London is full of rumours, endlessly. To which do you refer?" "To the suggestion that the fiasco in Russia has weakened Napoleon to the extent that he is now willing to explore the possibility of making peace with England." "Never happen," said Kilmartin. "So certain. Napoleon would never agree to England's terms." "And if he did—" Sebastian watched the other man's face. "You would stand to lose a lot of money." Kilmartin's smile never slipped. All good things must come to an end. "True, but some eventualities can be postponed, especially by those ruthless enough to use any means possible." Kilmartin leaned forward, his grip on the knife and fork tightening. "What are you suggesting? That I had Damien Peloton waylaid and murdered in some back alley in the hopes that it might disrupt the delegation from Paris? How absurd!" I never suggested Peloton was part of a delegation from Paris. For a moment, Sebastian's words seemed to hang in the silence between them. The Scotsman froze, his narrowed grey eyes fixed on Sebastian's, a dark malevolence replacing the faint derision that had been there before. He kept his voice low and even, his knife suspended in the air between them. If I proposed to put an end to Booney's somewhat tentative peace feelers, I would do it by killing that fat former priest masquerading as a diplomat, not his doctor. Sebastian shook his head. Too obvious. Why kill Von Droy when you can get rid of him in a different way? The man is morbidly obsessed with his own health. It's conceivable that without his doctor he might decide to abandon his attempts at diplomacy and scuttle back across the Channel. The humour was back in the other man's eyes. Really? Then Peloton's killer was more clever than I've realized. I'd like to take credit, but I'm afraid I can't. Sebastian watched the Scotsman set down his knife and reach for his ale. Why did you really meet with Peloton in the park last Thursday morning? Kilmartin rolled his ale around on his tongue, his lips pursed, his eyes alive with mischief. But he only shook his head, as if hugging to himself some secret too amusing to share. Sebastian was crossing the vestibule, headed toward the street, when he heard himself hailed by a mountain of a man being pushed in a wheeled chair by a flamboyantly dressed dandy. "Sir," said Sebastian, changing direction to walk up to him, "I didn't expect to see you in London." The Comte de Provence smiled, his cheeks bunching with rosy good cheer. "Marie-Thérèse wanted to come into town for a few days. Go to the theatre, maybe buy a new hat, that sort of thing. And then there's the Duchess of Claiborne's soirée Tuesday night." He gave Sebastian a studied look, as if trying to recall an elusive fact. "She's some relative of yours, is she not?" "My aunt." The small frown cleared. "Ah, thought so. Then perhaps we shall see you there." "Perhaps." Provence gave one of his belly-shaking laughs. "Not a fan of that sort of thing, are you?" His laugh turned into a cough. "I'd say I blame you at your age." "Do I take it you're staying in South Audley Street?" "Indeed, indeed." Artois is up, chasing some light skirts around Scotland. So if he doesn't like it, there's not much he can do about it now, is there? Sebastian glanced over at Ambrose Lachapelle, but the courtier turned his head and looked away, as if distrusting his ability to maintain a straight face. "I've discovered something interesting about the young French doctor who was killed," said Sebastian. The uncrowned King of France let his eyes go wide in a clumsy pantomime of astonishment. "Oh?" "It seems Damien Peloton was the son of Dr. Philippe Jean Peloton, the same Dr. Peloton who treated the young Dauphin in the Temple prison." "Indeed? What an odd coincidence." Sebastian studied the Bourbon's plump, self-indulgent face. One couldn't exactly call a monarch, even an uncrowned one, a liar. "You mean to say you didn't recognize the name?" "Well, I recognize the similarity in the names, of course," blustered the Bourbon. "But I'd no notion they were... His son, you say? How very intriguing." "Not to mention coincidental." Yes, to be sure, to be sure." "I wonder, would you happen to know why Damien Peloton was in London?" The Comte de Provence fixed Sebastian with an unexpectedly hard stare, and it occurred to Sebastian that however jovial his features or good-natured his demeanour, it would never do to forget that this man was the grandson of King Louis XV, or that he had grown to manhood surrounded by all the splendor and intrigue of the French court at Versailles. "Now, how would I know that?" he asked. "We don't all have the network of informants and spies available to someone such as, say, your own father-in-law." Sebastian was aware of the courtier, La Chapelle, sucking the flesh of one inner cheek between his teeth. It was obvious that Ambrose La Chapelle realized, even if Provence himself did not, that he just inadvertently revealed he knew exactly why Damien Pelletan was in London. Sebastian said, "Tell me about your nephew, the Dauphin." The shift in topic seemed to confuse the aging Bourbon. "My nephew? What is there to tell? He was a sweet boy, just 7 years old, and the picture of health when he was thrown into prison." "What happened to him?" The old man sighed. "Nothing, at first. For some months after the execution of his father, the king, the boy was allowed to remain with his mother, aunt, and sister. But then one day the guards came and took him away. Seems the revolutionaries had ordered the jailers to remove all traces of what they called arrogance and royalty from him." A pinched look came over his features. "They treated him very badly." "When did he die?" "The 8th of June, 1795. "And Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan performed the autopsy?" "He was one of the doctors present, yes." "There were others?" 2 or 3, I believe, although Pelletan may have been the only one who had actually seen the boy just a day or 2 before, when he was brought to the prison to treat his illness." "Did he identify the body as belonging to the Dauphin?" "Mon Dieu!" Angry purple colour suffused the normally placid royal's plump features. "I hope to God you're not suggesting that those ridiculous old whispers are true." "Which whispers?" "As if you do not know. The idea that the Dauphin did not die in the temple, that he was spirited away from prison while the body of some other poor lad was left in his place." The persistence of the myth that the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had not actually died in prison was an obvious source of embarrassment and chagrin to the 2 uncles and cousin who dreamt of someday occupying the dead Dauphin's vacant throne. When Sebastian simply remained silent, Provence said, "Please to God you won't say anything of this to my niece Marie-Thérèse. You've no notion the distress these rumours cause her. Oh, how many charlatans have presented themselves to her over the years, claiming to be her long-lost brother. I've seen her made ill for days by one of those encounters." Sebastian frowned. "She did not see the Dauphin's body after his death?" "No, nor had she seen him for nearly 2 years before that. The boy was torn from his mother's arms in the summer of 93. Marie-Thérèse never saw him again." "Seems curious that the revolutionaries didn't show the body to the boy's sister, if for no other reason than to remove all doubt as to his fate once and for all." "I wish they had," grumbled Provence, shifting his considerable weight in his chair. "They would have saved us all a great deal of bother." "Are you certain the boy actually is dead?" He expected the Bourbon to bluster and heatedly deny the very possibility of any suggestion that the Dauphin might still live. Instead, he blinked, his eyes swimming with a sudden uprush of emotion, his skin looking mottled and prematurely old. "If by some miracle the boy did survive, I'm not saying I believe he did, mind you, but if, by some miracle, my poor nephew is truly alive out there, somewhere, he would not be fit to be king. What those animals did to him in that prison, let's just say it would have destroyed him, both physically and mentally." "What did they do to him?" asked Sebastian. To his surprise, it was the courtier Ambrose Lachapelle who answered him. "You don't want to know," he said softly. "Believe me, you don't want to know." Chapter 22. A sharp, bitter wind slapped into Sebastian's face as he walked up St. James's Street toward Piccadilly. Settling his hat more firmly on his head, he became aware of an elegant town carriage drawn by a beautifully matched team of dapple greys slowing beside him. He heard the snap of the near window being let down, saw the crest of the house of Jarvis proudly emblazoned on the door panel. He kept walking. "I had a troubling conversation this morning with a certain overwrought and somewhat choleric Parisian," said Charles Lord Jarvis. "Oh?" Sebastian turned onto Berkeley Square. The carriage rolled along beside him. "You simply cannot leave well enough alone, can you?" Sebastian gave a low, soft laugh. "No." His father-in-law was not amused. "With any other man, I might be tempted to hint at all sorts of dire consequences to life and limb, your life and limb. But in this case, I realize such tactics would be counterproductive. Shall I appeal instead to your better nature?" Sebastian drew up and pivoted to face him. "My better nature? Do explain." The liveried coachman brought his horses to a standstill. Jarvis chose his words carefully, obviously conscious of the listening servants. "I've no doubt that by now you know what's at stake here. Given your oft-stated attitudes towards this war, I should think you would be anxious not to do anything that might interfere with a process that could save lives. Millions of lives." "Oh? And when have you ever cared about saving lives?" Jarvis's face lit up with what looked like a genuine smile. "Seldom. However, I'm well aware of which arguments are most likely to appeal to you, and what is at stake here is real." Sebastian studied his father-in-law's arrogant, self-satisfied face, the aquiline nose and brutally intelligent grey eyes that were so much like heroes. Sebastian knew of no one who was a more ardent supporter of the institution of hereditary monarchy than Jarvis. In Jarvis's thinking, Napoleon Bonaparte was an upstart Corsican soldier of fortune, whose ambition-fueled ascension to the throne of France threatened to undermine every foundation of civilization and the social order. All of which made it exceedingly difficult for Sebastian to believe that Jarvis would countenance any peace treaty that might result in Britain's retirement from the field of battle, leaving Napoleon still enshrined as emperor. Sebastian said, "I fail to understand how my simple inquiries could possibly threaten even such a delicate process." "You don't know everything." "Oh? So enlighten me." But Jarvis simply tightened his jaw and signalled his coachman to drive on, the horse's hooves clattering over the paving stones, the body of the carriage swaying with well-sprung delicacy as the team picked up speed. Chapter 23. Later that afternoon, when none of the older women Gibson typically hired to sit with his most critically ill patients was available for the approaching night, he had Alexandre Sauvage wrapped in a blanket and carried next door to the inner chamber of his own house. "You don't need to do this," she whispered hoarsely as he tucked his worn quilt around her. "Yes, I do." She was showing hopeful signs of improvement, but her eyes were still dull with fever, her cheeks hollow, her flesh like hot, dry parchment to the touch. She let her lids flutter closed, and he thought she slept. Then she said, "My woman, Carmela, is a good nurse. You could send for her." "I will." He started to move away, then barely bit back a gasp when, without warning, a burning jolt of agony shot up his leg, as brutal and real as if someone had thrust a red-hot poker into the sole of his left foot. The foot that was no longer there. She opened her eyes and fixed her gaze on his face. "You're in pain? Why?" He shook his head. "I'm fine." And when he knew from the incredulity of her expression that she didn't believe him, he said, "I sometimes get pains from my missing foot and leg. It will pass. There is a way." "Hush," he said, smoothing the covers over her. "Go to sleep." He didn't expect her to listen to him, because he was learning that she was not the most cooperative of patients. But to his surprise, she did. He went to settle in the chair beside the fire and carefully removed his peg leg. It did no good. The pain persisted, so intense now that if his left foot had still been attached to his body, he'd have been tempted to whack it off himself just to end the agony. But you can't amputate a limb that isn't there. He felt the sweat start on his face, and a fine trembling made his hand shake as he brought up one crooked arm to swipe his sleeve across his forehead. The urge to set his mind free from the pain, to escape into the sweetly hued dreams of laudanum, was damned near overwhelming. He had to grit his teeth, his hands clutching the arms of the chair, his gaze fixed on the fever-racked woman who lay in his bed. And he found himself wondering if this was why he had brought her here, why he resisted sending for her woman. If he were only fooling himself, convincing himself that he was fighting to save her life, when the truth was that by her very presence she was saving him. Chapter 24. "The problem, my lady, is that your humours are out of balance." Richard Croft, the most distinguished and respected accoucheur in Britain, stood with his back to the fire, his chin sunk deep into the folds of his snowy white cravat. In his early 50s, he was a slight man, with wisps of fading pale hair that fell from a slightly receding hairline. Like his face, his nose was long, his chin pronounced, his lips thin and drawn, as if he were constantly tightening and sucking them in disapproval. Hero sat in a nearby chair, her hands in her lap, her maid standing behind her. "I feel fine," she said. "Ah," Croft tisked, and shook his head with a deprecating smile that filled Hero with an undignified urge to box his ears. "You may feel fine, but unfortunately that does not mean all is as it should be. What did you eat yesterday?" Hero told him. Croft fluttered his soft white hands in horror. "But that is far too much. You must take only a cup of tea for breakfast, and not before 10. Then at 2 you may have a bite of cold meat or some fruit, but not both. Your dinner must be equally sparse, a thin soup perhaps, or some fowl with a small serving of well-cooked vegetables. Bland, of course. If I reduce myself to the regime you suggest, I shall soon be too weak to walk across the room. But that is precisely the idea, my lady. I was reading an article yesterday written by a Dr. Agostina Di Fiori at the University of Padua." "A woman?" sputtered Croft. "An Italian woman?" "Who argues that while a woman should take care not to gain too much weight, it is nevertheless important that she continue to consume a varied and adequate amount of healthy foods. To do otherwise not only debilitates the health of the mother, but also puts the child at risk." "Utter nonsense, I'm afraid." He cleared his throat. "I trust you have been taking the purges I prescribed?" "They don't agree with me." "They are not supposed to agree with you. They are designed to bring your humours back into balance. My lady, I beg of you, you must trust me in this." He brought up his hands, palms together as if he were praying. "Your colour is too robust, and you have far too much energy. At this point, patients who follow my strictures are pale and languid, as befits a woman about to give birth. I shall have to bleed you again." Hero watched in silence as he turned to remove a basin and lancet from his satchel. "Most severely, I'm afraid," he said. "Under the circumstances, I suspect that to take any less than 2 pints would be folly." 2 pints? "Yes, my lady," he said, advancing on her with his lips cinched tight, and his eyes weary with benign contempt for the weaker sex, with whose folly he struggled daily. By the time Sebastian reached Brook Street, a light snow had begun to fall. Big, soft white flakes that fluttered down to stick to the pavement and the iron railing guarding the area steps. "Bit wet out there, my lord?" asked his majordomo, Maury, as he took Sebastian's hat, greatcoat, and gloves. "I suspect we're in for a good deal more of this before nightfall." Sebastian's gaze fell on the modest gentleman's hat resting on a nearby chair. "I take it Richard Croft is here?" "Yes, my lord, he—" The majordomo broke off as a loud rattling clatter sounded from above. A moment later, a small, slight man came charging down the stairs, the tails of his black coat billowing behind him, his satchel gripped before him in both hands. He had his head down, his lips clamped in an angry line, his prominent chin set mulishly. But at the sight of Sebastian, he drew up, nostrils flaring, his entire frame a-quiver with his indignation. "Lord Devlin," he said, taking the last step down to the entrance hall and bowing stiffly, "I am pleased to see that you are here, for it affords me the opportunity to tell you that I refuse, yes, refuse to act as Lady Devlin's accoucheur any longer. She is stubborn and opinionated, full of outlandish ideas gleaned from reading an assortment of ridiculous foreign publications. She ignores my advice, refuses my prescriptions, and just now she threw my basin at me when I attempted to insist that she allow me to bleed her." "And how precisely did you insist?" Croft's thin chest jerked with the agitation of his breathing. "Sometimes, with expectant mothers, the emotions run high, and a touch of male firmness is required." "You're fortunate she didn't take the lancet to you." Croft's features darkened with a resurgence of fury. "Indeed, she threatened to do so." He tugged at the lower hem of his waistcoat, which had become wrapped up in his hasty descent of the stairs. "I cannot be held responsible for the outcome of a confinement when the patient refuses to submit herself to my lowering system. Therefore, I resign my position. Nor can I, in all good conscience, recommend her as a patient to any of my colleagues. To be frank, under the circumstances, I can't imagine how you will find anyone competent to agree to attempt to deliver her." "Under what circumstances?" asked Sebastian with deceptive restraint. The esteemed Richard Croft opened his mouth, then thought better of what he'd been about to say, and closed it. Sebastian advanced on him. "What the devil are you saying?" Croft took a step back, his heels clattering against the riser of the first stair. "What circumstances, damn you?" The accoucheur swallowed hard. "The child, yes?" He swallowed again. "The child is in the wrong position. By now it should have shifted, so that the head is down in preparation for entering the birth passage. It has not done so. Instead, it is lying crossways." Sebastian felt as if someone had reached into his chest to twist his heart and elbow his gut, so that it was a moment before he was able to say, "What can be done?" Croft shook his head. "Nothing." "What do you mean, nothing?" "The child may turn itself." "And if it doesn't?" The accoucheur sidled toward the door. "Some babes which present in a breech position are born successfully." "And the mothers?" "Some mothers survive," said Croft, but— "But?" Croft straightened his spine and met Sebastian's fierce gaze with a fortitude Sebastian couldn't help but admire. But rarely both. Chapter 25. Sebastian found Hero standing at the window of her chamber, one hand on the panel of heavy drapes at her side, her gaze on the flurry of snow falling from the sky. "I owe the poor man an apology," she said, as Sebastian came to stand behind her. "Did you really throw his basin at him?" "I did. Shameful, is it not?" He slipped his arms around her and drew her back against him. She smelled of silk and lavender and herself, and for a moment the upswelling of emotions within him was so powerful that he had to squeeze his eyes shut. "Perhaps. But nevertheless understandable. The man is a pompous, pedantic ass." She shook her head. "Croft may be an idiot, but he means well. He truly believes in what he prescribes." When Sebastian remained silent, she said, "I take it he told you the child will, in all likelihood, be breech." "He said it might still turn." "It might." He brought his hands up to rest them on the swell of her belly. He hoped she didn't notice that they weren't quite steady. He said, "We need to find a new accoucheur, someone who is not an idiot." "They're all idiots." She tipped her head back against his shoulder, her lips curving into an odd smile. "If you ask me, the child's position is the real reason Croft bowed out. He's afraid." What accoucheur in his right mind wouldn't be afraid of attending Lord Jarvis's daughter in a difficult delivery, thought Sebastian. But he didn't say it. "What about Gibson?" she suggested. "Gibson is a surgeon, not a physician or accoucheur," he reminded her. "You think I care for that? You know as well as I do that he's delivered babies. Surely he could at least recommend someone." "Unfortunately, I believe he shares your opinion of the profession, but I can ask." He was silent for a moment, his thoughts crowded again with the memory of all the babes her mother had lost. Why had she lost them, he wondered. Were they breech, or did they die for some other reason entirely? Some abnormality that had, in the end, come close to taking Lady Jarvis's life as well. "I know what you're thinking," said Hero, "but I am not my mother." She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to cup his cheek as she kissed him on the mouth. "Everything will be fine." He speared his fingers through her hair, cradling the back of her head and holding her close as he let his gaze drift over the familiar line of her cheeks, the soft curve of her lips. He wanted to tell her that the thought of losing her terrified him, that he could no longer even imagine a life without her in it. Yet he'd never said these things to her, never even whispered those 3 simple words, "I love you." To say them now would seem to suggest that he feared she might die. And so he kept silent. She was braver than he. "I don't intend to die, Devlin." He rested his forehead against hers, but he still said nothing, for she knew as well as he that the hour of our death is rarely of our own choosing. By the time Sebastian reached Tower Hill, the snow was falling thick and fast, big flakes that stung his face and rapidly covered the city in a blanket of white. "Good God, Devlin," said Gibson, as Sebastian came in stomping snow off his boots. "What in the name of all that's holy are you doing out in this?" Sebastian shrugged out of his wet greatcoat. "I need the name of a good accoucheur, Gibson." Gibson paused in the act of leading the way to his small parlour to look back at him in surprise. "I was under the impression the esteemed Richard Croft would be attending Lady Devlin." He resigned. "He would have me believe it is because Lady Devlin is not the most meek and cooperative patient, which I will be the first to admit she is not." But if truth be told, I think it's because he's afraid of Jarvis. The babe is lying breech, Gibson. I wouldn't worry too much at this point. It's early days yet. The babe's not due until April. It'll turn when it's ready. Sebastian met his friend's gaze. I'm afraid that's a polite fiction told to still the tongues of society's gossips. The child is expected in a week or two. Ah. The expression on the Irishman's face confirmed every one of Sebastian's worst fears, and then some. Mother Mary, he said softly, and turned away to pour 2 glasses of Burgundy. It's bad, isn't it? Said Sebastian, watching him. Gibson held out one of the wine glasses. Sometimes a babe will shift at the last minute. Sebastian took his glass and drank long and deep. The name of a good accoucheur, Gibson. I need one. Quickly. Gibson pushed a tumbled lock of hair off his forehead. Sebastian noticed that his friend had not only shaved, but also put on a clean cravat, and evidently bullied Mrs. Federico into ironing one of his shirts, too. Let me think on it a bit. I'll ask around tomorrow. Sebastian went to sink into one of the cracked leather chairs beside the fire. It was then that he noticed someone had picked up the newspapers that normally littered the floor. He let his gaze drift over the recently dusted mantel, the fresh candles in the sconces flanking the fireplace. How is your patient? You can ask me yourself, said Alexandre Sauvage, coming to stand in the doorway. She looked much the same as Sebastian remembered her from 3 years before, her hair still the same riotous cloud of sunset-shot fire, her eyes the same unexpectedly dark brown. But away from the hot sun of Spain, her skin was paler, and she was thinner, her cheekbones more pronounced in a way that gave her an air of fragility he knew was utterly deceptive. "Good God, what are you doing out of bed?" Gibson demanded, going to steer her wobbly steps to a nearby chair. She wore the same faded dress he'd seen that first night, and from the looks of things she'd just pulled it on. "I heard you talking," she said, settling with a soft, quickly suppressed sigh into the chair opposite his. He could see the tight lines bracketing her lips, and knew how much it had cost her to leave her bed. "You don't look like you should be up." "She shouldn't be," said Gibson. Her gaze met Sebastian's. He saw the flare of smouldering animosity in her eyes, and something else, like the wariness of a cornered fox. He said, "What can you tell us about the night Damien Pelletan was killed?" She put her hand to her forehead, as if the mere effort of thought brought a renewed surge of pain. "I'm afraid I don't remember much." "Can you tell us the name of the man who went with you to the Gifford Arms?" She frowned at him in confusion, her hand falling back to her side. "What man? What are you talking about?" "I went alone. That I do remember." Gibson and Sebastian exchanged looks. Sebastian said, "According to a certain Mitt Peebles, a veiled woman and an unknown man asked to see Pelletan at about 9 o'clock the night he died. He went outside to speak to them. Then he came inside for his greatcoat and left." She shook her head. "I don't know anything about them. Damien never mentioned them to me. When I arrived at the inn, he was standing outside, staring up at the stars. I asked what he was doing. It was so cold that night. He said he was just thinking." Sebastian studied her pale, tightly held face. But if she was lying, she was giving nothing away. "And then what?" "I asked him to come with me to see Claire Bissette's child. He went inside for his greatcoat, then we hailed a hackney carriage. We told the jarvey where we wanted to go, only when we reached the tower, the man refused to enter St. Catherine's and insisted on setting us down, so we had to walk the rest of the way to Hangman's Court. After that," she shrugged, "I know we saw Cecile, but I barely remember it." And nothing after that. She held Sebastian's gaze as if defying him to disbelieve her, and he thought, why? Why would she be keeping back something that might lead them to the person or persons who had tried to kill her? She said, I heard what you said about your wife. What about my wife? There is a way to turn a babe in the womb that involves manually applying pressure to the belly to externally manipulate the child. But it must be done soon. If you leave it too late, it becomes considerably more difficult. Sounds dangerous. Not if you know what you're doing. Sebastian glanced over at Gibson. Is it possible? Gibson shrugged. I've heard tales of such a thing being done, but are they true? I don't know. I've never spoken to anyone who's attempted it. I have done it, said Alexandre Sauvage, leaning forward. It doesn't always work. But you must allow me to at least make the attempt. If the babe doesn't turn before its time comes— Her voice trailed off, and Sebastian felt a renewed yawn of terror open up within him. He said, No. She flopped back in the chair, her hands gripping the worn, rolled leather arms. What do you think? That I would deliberately harm an innocent child and a woman I have never met? Simply to get back at you? Yes. She pushed to her feet, her face white, her arms trembling with the effort. Your friend is a fool, she told Gibson, and left the room. Gibson stared after her. Sebastian said, You didn't tell me she was better. She isn't better. Her fever is broken, but I meant it when I said she shouldn't be up. He brought his gaze back to Sebastian's face. Care to tell me what the bloody hell that was about? You mean to say she hasn't told you? No. Sebastian drained his wine and went to pour himself another glass. You remember I said I'd seen her before, in Portugal? Yes. I was on a mission for Colonel Sinclair Oliphant when I was taken captive by a troop of French cavalry. She was with them. Her lover was a lieutenant named Tissot. When I escaped, I killed him. There was more to the tale, far more. But Gibson had been back in London by the time of the incident, and Sebastian had never told his friend any of the wretched details. Gibson said, You think she holds a grudge against you? Sebastian looked over at him. The wind blew the snow against the window pane like a soft whisper from a long-vanished past. What do you think? Gibson went to throw more coal on the fire. Then he simply stood there, one hand braced against the mantel, his gaze on the fire before him. After a moment, Sebastian said, I've discovered something that may or may not be relevant. Damien Pelleton's father was one of the doctors who performed the autopsy on the little Dauphin when he died in the temple. He also treated the boy before his death. Gibson turned to stare at him. You can't be serious. The Comte de Provence himself confirmed it. Gibson shook his head. Don't like the sound of that. Neither do I. Particularly when you consider that Damien Pelleton was murdered on the anniversary of Louis XVI's death. Gibson pushed away from the fireplace. How much do you know about the death of the last Dauphin? I'm not sure how much anyone knows about those days. But there's a courtier who is close to Provence, a man by the name of Ambrose Lachapelle. I think he knows considerably more than he's letting on. About a lot of things. Do you think you could convince him to talk? Sebastian finished his wine and set the glass aside. I don't know, but I intend to try. Chapter 26. After Devlin left, Gibson went to stand in the doorway to the inner chamber. Alexandre Sauvage lay, still dressed, atop the bed. She had her head tipped back, her eyes closed. He could see what the effort of rising, even for those few moments, had cost her in every fragile line of her being. He said, "That was not wise." She turned her face to look at him. "I am getting better." "You won't if you keep pulling stunts like this one." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. She had a full, generous mouth, gently curved in a way that made a man long to rub the pad of his thumb along its soft lines. She said, "He hadn't told you? About Portugal, I mean?" "No." Her slim throat worked as she swallowed. "And does it alter your opinion of me, to know that I once took a lover?" "Why should it? I've had a few lovers myself, you know." He'd never had a wife, though, and no woman at all since he lost his leg. But he didn't see any reason to tell her that. "That's different." "I don't know why it should be." "You know why. Our society expects, no, demands, very different conduct from men and women." He said, "What happened to you after your lover was killed?" He thought for a moment she wasn't going to answer him, and if he could have unsaid the question, he would have. It was too personal, too much a betrayal of his interest in her, and he knew by the pinched look around her eyes that those days had been bleak. She said, "I took up with a British captain, Miles Sauvage. How do you English say it? Ah, yes, I remember. He made an honest woman of me." It's a curious expression, don't you agree? An honest woman is a very different creature from an honest man, and has nothing to do with the truth or lack thereof, just as a woman's honor is a very different thing from a man's. It's as if, when it comes to women, all possible virtues, honesty, honor, even virtue itself, are reduced simply to whom we allow between our legs. When he said nothing, she gave a crooked smile. "Now I have shocked you." He shook his head. "I don't shock as easily as you may think. Although that was your intent, was it not? To shock me?" She tilted her head, her gaze on his face, and he knew he'd read her right, but he was unprepared for her next assault. She said, "I wonder, does your good friend Viscount Devlin know of your taste for opium?" Gibson sucked in a quick breath. "He knows I take laudanum from time to time. He was with me when they cut off what was left of my leg, held me down while the surgeon went at me with his saw." "How long ago now?" 4, 5 years. In Gibson's experience, 4 out of 5 men who lost an arm or a leg or a hand or a foot suffered intermittent pain that seemed to come from their missing limb. The fact that the limb was no longer there didn't make the pain any less real or any less agonizing. Sometimes it felt like an intense, crippling cramp. At other times, it was as sharp and stabbing as a knife blade thrust deep into long-vanished flesh. It could go on and on, then suddenly disappear, only to start up again without warning a few minutes or a few days later. For many men, the pains came less frequently with the passage of time until they eventually vanished altogether, usually after a few months. But for some, the pains never went away. He'd known men to take their own lives simply to get away from the pain. He said, "The laudanum helps me focus on other things." "Yes, but it takes more and more every year, does it not?" She paused, then said gently, "You know where this will end. I can control it." "How?" "By walking the stews of London when the urge to lose yourself entirely in a poppy-hued mist threatens to become overwhelming." "How did you—" He broke off. "How did I know? That's why you were in St. Catherine's the night you found me?" "Call it a good guess. How do I know you've taken laudanum tonight? It's quite dark in here, yet your pupils are little more than pinpricks. I can control it, he said again. If you truly believe that, you are a fool. He felt hot colour stain his cheeks, but whether it was from anger or shame he couldn't have said. He carefully straightened his spine. I will leave you to rest, he said, and limped from the room, shutting the door carefully behind him. At various times during the evening he was tempted to rejoin the argument. There were 2 small chambers at the front of his house, one leading to the other, and both overlooking the street. He had given her the inner room, and he could see the glow of her candle beneath the door, hear by her occasional cough that she was still awake. But he resisted, as much because he suspected he would lose any argument on the subject, as from the knowledge that the last thing she needed in her condition was a heated dispute with a delusional opium-eater. He stood in the darkened outer chamber, his gaze on the snowy street beyond the cold frosted window. A few stray flakes still drifted down, but for now the snow appeared to have ended, leaving the street ankle-deep in a soft white layer of fluff. The sky above was dark and starless, the moon hidden behind the thick clouds pressing down on the city. The roofs of the ancient stone houses of Tower Hill shrouded thick with snow and dripping icicles that glimmered in the lantern of a passing carriage. For a brief instant, the lantern light played over the harsh features of a man who stood in the shadows of a doorway opposite. Then the carriage rattled past, and the man disappeared again into the darkness. Gibson was aware of the door opening behind him, of Alexandre Sauvage coming to stand beside him. She wore only her shift, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders for warmth. She said, "I couldn't sleep. It was wrong of me to taunt you the way I did. It is difficult enough to resist the allure of opium when the pain for which it was prescribed has ended. But when the pain persists—" "You weren't wrong." She gave him a crooked smile that caught treacherously at his chest. "Not in what I said, no, but for the way in which I said it. I owe you an apology. You saved my life, and I repaid you abominably. Many's the time I've been called a fool, and worse. It's not as if—" He broke off as a faint red glow, like tobacco burning in the bowl of a clay pipe, showed from out of the darkness. For perhaps the 1000th time in his life, Gibson found himself wishing he possessed Devlin's unnatural ability to see in the dark. "What is it?" she asked. Gibson nodded to the snow-filled street before them. "There's a man in the arch of that doorway, across the lane. I noticed him a few minutes ago. He's just standing there, and he's none too anxious to be seen. You think he's watching the house? Why else is he there? I had a quick glimpse of him when the light from a passing carriage lantern fell on him. I don't think I've ever seen him before. He's a big brute, with long curly dark hair and a neck thick enough to rival the piers of London Bridge." "Bullock," she whispered, her lips parting, the fingertips of one hand coming up to press against the frosted glass of the window. He shifted his gaze to the woman beside him. "And who might Bullock be?" "He's a Titchbourne Street cabinet-maker who blames me for his brother's death." "What the devil would he be doing here?" She shook her head. "I don't know how he found out where I am, but he's been watching me for weeks, following me." "Matter of fact." Gibson pushed away from the window. "Well, I think maybe I'll just go on out there and ask Mr. Bullock what the bloody hell he thinks he's doing." She caught his arm as he headed for the door, pulling him back around with a strength that surprised him. "Are you mad? Bullock once killed an apprentice with his bare hands, caved in the poor lad's skull. Somehow he managed to convince the magistrates it was manslaughter and got off with only being burned in the hand, but it wasn't manslaughter, it was murder." Gibson gave her a smile that showed his teeth. "That's me, all right. A one-legged mad fool." Something leapt in her eyes. "I didn't mean—" The rattle of a wagon trace jerked their attention again to the lane. A brewer's wagon laboured through the snow, pulled by a heavy team and preceded by a trotting link boy. The link boy's flaring torch played over the crumbling archway where the curly-headed man had lurked. It was now empty. "He's gone," she said, her hand clenching on the folds of the blanket she held tightly around her. "This is what he does. He watches me for a while, and then he goes away." "And did it never occur to you that this bullock could very well be the man who attacked you in Cat's Hole and ripped out Damien Pelleton's heart?" She shook her head. "If he'd killed me, it might make sense. But why let me live and kill Damien?" An arrested expression came over her features. "Unless—" "Unless what?" prompted Gibson when she broke off. But she only shook her head, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together as if she were afraid to give voice to her thoughts. Chapter 27. That evening, as the snow continued to fall, Sebastian prowled the taverns and coffee-houses of the city. He began in Pall Mall and Piccadilly, targeting very specific establishments, places like the White Hart and the Queen's Head that catered to a special kind of clientele. As he ventured farther east, the patrons became perceptibly rougher, bricklayers and butchers now mingling with barristers, soldiers, and the occasional well-dressed dandy or Corinthian. They were a disparate lot, although all shared one dangerous secret. In an age when carnal knowledge of one's own sex was a capital offence, these men risked death to meet and mingle with one another. Many of the men, or mollies as they often called themselves, adopted aliases, colourful monikers like Marigold Mistress, or Nell Gin, or St. Giles's Jan. Sebastian was looking for a certain well-known flamboyant Miss Molly, known as Serena Fox. But he was having trouble finding her. He was standing at the counter of a tavern just off Lincoln's Inn Fields, drinking a pint of ale and watching two men, one dressed in an elegant blue velvet gown, the other a bricklayer in heavy boots, dance, when a tall, slim woman in an emerald silk gown came to lean against a nearby wall, her hands behind her back, her head tilted to one side. "I hear you're looking for Serena Fox?" rather indefatigably. Sebastian shifted his stance and took a slow swallow of his ale. The woman was no longer young, but her softly curling chestnut hair was still vibrant, the flesh of her strong, square jaw still taut, her mouth wide and full. "Hello, La Chapelle," said Sebastian. She pursed her lips and shook her head, her French accent a throaty purr. "Here, it is Serena. What do you want with me?" "I need some rather delicate information, and asking questions of royals, even dethroned ones, tends to be both difficult and unproductive." "Is there a reason why I should help you?" Sebastian took a deep drink of his ale. 3 days ago, a man with ties to the Bourbons had his heart ripped out by an unknown killer. I should think that would be reason enough for anyone interested in the well-being of the dynasty. Serena's features remained flawlessly composed, but Sebastian saw her nostrils flare on a quick, betraying breath. "I can tell you some things. What do you want to know?" "Is it true that Marie-Thérèse shuts herself in her chamber every 21st of January and devotes the day to prayer?" "Every January 21st and every October 16th. "Why the 16th of October?" "That is the day her mother, Marie Antoinette, was guillotined." "What about the 8th of June?" Serena shook her head, not understanding. "What's the significance of the 8th of June?" "That's the date her little brother, the Dauphin, died in the Temple prison, according to Provence." "Ah, That's right. Serena turned to signal for a brandy. Sebastian watched her. He said, "Marie-Thérèse doesn't believe her little brother is really dead, does she?" Serena raked her hair back from her head in a gesture that was considerably more masculine than feminine. "I suspect it would be more accurate to say she hopes he is alive, but I've always suspected that in her heart of hearts she knows he is not." "Tell me what happened to him." Serena lowered her gaze to the amber liquid in her glass. It was a moment before she spoke. "The Dauphin was 8 years old when he was taken from the room in which Marie-Antoinette and Marie-Thérèse were kept, and thrust alone into a cell directly below them. When he cried for his mother, his jailers beat him, unmercifully. His mother and sister could hear his screams, hear him begging for them to stop. But that was only the beginning." He paused. "Go on." "The revolutionaries, perhaps even Robespierre himself, drew up a confession they insisted he sign. When he refused, they beat him again, day after day." "What sort of confession?" "In it he claimed to have been seduced by his mother and debauched by his sister and his Aunt Elizabeth. They wanted to use it at the Queen's trial." "Did he sign it?" "In the end, yes. But surely no one believes such nonsense." Serena shrugged. "Far too many people will believe anything of those they hate, no matter how absurd or patently fabricated it may be. And to the revolutionaries, the Bourbons became the personification of evil." "What happened after he did as they demanded and signed the confession?" "I've heard his jailers had promised that if he signed, he'd be allowed to rejoin what was left of his family. But it was a promise they did not keep. His jailer was a member of the Paris Commune, a cobbler named Antoine Simon. Simon's instructions were to erase all traces of gentility and pride in the boy. On good days, Simon and his wife taught him the language of the gutters, plied him with wine, put a bonnet rouge on his head, and taught him to sing the Marseillaise. On bad days, they beat him, just for the fun of it." Sebastian took a swallow of his ale, but it tasted bitter and flat on his tongue. Serena said, "Yet as bad as all that was, it eventually grew worse. Simon and his wife were replaced with new jailers who starved the boy and refused to empty his slop bucket. The window of his cell was blocked up, depriving the child of both light and air. He grew increasingly ill. With no one to care for him, he was simply left to lie in his own excrement. He eventually lost the ability either to walk or speak." Serena glanced over at Sebastian. "You're certain you want to hear this?" "Yes." Serena nodded. "We know these things because after the events of Thermidor, enquiries were made. A representative of the National Convention, a man by the name of Barras, was sent to visit the children in the temple. He found the Dauphin lying on a filthy cot in a dark, noisome room so foul no one could even enter it. His skin was grey-green, his rags and hair alive with vermin, his stomach bloated from starvation, his half-naked body covered with bruises and welts from his endless beatings. And his mind. He was visibly terrified of anyone and everyone who came near him, and completely unable to speak." "So what happened?" "At Barras's insistence, the child was given a new jailer, a man named Laurent, who was ordered to see that the boy was bathed and fed, and his cell cleaned. They say that on occasion Laurent would even carry the boy up to the tower's battlements so that he could breathe the fresh air and watch the birds flying in the sky. But it was all too late. . The boy was desperately ill. He died." And how was Marie-Thérèse treated all this time? The question seemed to puzzle the courtier. She remained in the room she had shared with her mother and aunt before their executions. It was a prison cell, yes, and somewhat shabby, but it was nothing like the hellhole in which her brother was left to rot. The walls were papered, the bed canopied, the mantel of white marble, although the hearth was often cold, and for a time she was forbidden both candles and a tinder-box. She was not starved or beaten. She was not well fed, but she was not starved or beaten. Sebastian was silent, his gaze on the shadows near the stairs, where the bricklayer and his erstwhile dancing partner were locked in a passionate embrace. After a moment, Serena said, "You think what happened nearly 20 years ago has something to do with the murder of the French physician?" "You don't?" Serena's tongue flicked out to touch her dry lips. "I have heard. I don't know that it is true, mind you, but—" "Yes?" prompted Sebastian. "I have heard that one of the doctors who performed the autopsy wrapped the Dauphin's heart in his handkerchief and took it away with him." "Good God! Why?" "It is traditional in France to preserve the arts of the members of the royal family. The bodies of the kings and queens of France were buried in Saint-Denis, but their hearts and other organs were ceremoniously preserved elsewhere, most typically at Val-de-Grâce." Sebastian studied the Molly's delicate features. "What are you suggesting?" But Serena only shook her head, her lips pressed firmly together as if some thoughts were too terrible to be spoken aloud. Sebastian arrived back at Brook Street to find Hero in the library, with a stack of books on the table beside her, the black cat curled up asleep on the hearth nearby. She looked up as he paused in the doorway, the golden light from the fire shimmering in her hair and throwing soft shadows across the calm features of her face. She looked so alive, so vibrant and healthy, that he couldn't believe she might be dead in a matter of days. She said, "Stop looking at me like that." He gave a startled huff of laughter. "Like what?" "You know what I mean." "I take it you saw Gibson?" "I did. He said he'll make some inquiries tomorrow." He came to place his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs brushing back and forth across the nape of her neck. After a moment he said, "The Frenchwoman, Alexandre Sauvage, is an Italian-trained physician, now practicing as a midwife. She says there is a way to turn a babe in the womb. It involves applying pressure to the belly. She claims she has done it before." He felt Hero stiffen beneath his hands. "Does Gibson believe it's possible?" "He doesn't know. And even the woman herself admits it can be dangerous if not done properly." "Do you trust her?" "No." He dropped his hands to his sides. "I killed someone who was dear to her once." "In Portugal?" "Yes." Hero closed the book she'd been reading and set it aside with the others. "Perhaps the babe will turn itself." "Perhaps." He tilted his head to read the title of the slim volume. "Réflexions historiques sur Marie-Antoinette." "What's all this?" "I've been reading various accounts of what happened to the royal family during the Terror." "And?" "What Lady Giselle told you is true. Marie-Thérèse does indeed have the blood-stained chemise worn by her father at the guillotine. The king's confessor saved it and gave it to her." "Seems a rather ghoulish thing to do." "It does. Yet I gather she cherishes it. It makes you wonder, does it not, about the time-honoured role of the royal confessor?" "A delicate position requiring much tact, I should think. Not so difficult when dealing with someone like Louis XVI, who by all accounts was a devout, loving husband and father, and who tried hard to be a just and honest king." But how do you, in all sincerity, grant absolution to a Louis XIV or a Richard III? Someone whose actions so obviously and repeatedly violate the dictates of his faith. I don't understand how such kings can honestly think they have received absolution. Perhaps they don't actually believe in their professed religion. Perhaps, although I suspect it's more likely they believe they have a special divine dispensation from above. She looked up at him. To sin and kill without compunction? Yes. Then why bother to confess at all? That I don't know. I suppose I could always try asking Marie-Thérèse herself. Hero gave a soft laugh. That would be interesting. He went to hunker beside the cat, which raised its head and looked at Sebastian with an air of bored tolerance. The cat had been with them for 4 months now, but still lacked a name. None of the various suggestions they'd come up with ever seemed to do justice to the cat's unique combination of arrogance and ennui. I just had an interesting conversation with Ambrose Lachapelle, he said. Oh? In quiet, measured tones, Sebastian repeated the French courtier's description of the treatment given to the Dauphin in the Temple prison. I've heard some of this before, she said, when he had finished, but not all of it. That poor child. She watched him scratch the cat behind its ears. Then she said, There's something about Lachapelle's tale that bothers you. What? Sebastian shifted his hand to stroke beneath the cat's chin, the cat lifting its head and slitting its eyes in rare contentment. There's too much in the traditional story of the orphans in the temple that simply doesn't add up. Such as? Why subject the boy to such savagely brutal treatment when his sister was allowed to live in comparative comfort in the room just above him? Once Louis XVI went to the guillotine, his son became the uncrowned King Louis XVII of France, the symbol of everything the revolutionaries hated. Marie-Thérèse, on the other hand, was a girl, a daughter of the king, yes, but under Salic law she could never inherit the throne. True, but Spain once observed Salic law too, and they managed to get around it. The risk was very real that France might someday do the same. So I don't think we can say she was no threat to the revolutionaries or the Republic. Yet they let her live. What else? I'm bothered by the shifts in the Dauphin's condition that Lachapelle described taking place. The Signes, the couple who had been the boy's first jailers, was suddenly removed and replaced with a changing succession of guards. At the same time, his cell's window was covered, leaving the boy in the dark. Why do that? To be cruel? It's possible. But I can think of another reason. You mean so that no one could get a good look at him or recognize him? Good heavens, Sebastian, surely you're not giving credence to those romantic tales about the Dauphin being spirited away from his prison, with some poor deaf-mute child left to die in his place? Sebastian rose to his feet. No, of course not. It's just... Why the devil did they not show the dead Dauphin's body to his sister? She was right there. Not simply in the same prison, but in the same tower, in the room directly above his. Why leave her in doubt? Why allow the whispers to spread and grow? Why not put all possibility of a substitution to rest once and for all? How do you know they didn't show her the dead Dauphin? He shook his head. I don't understand. What if they did show her the child's body? Only she was so horrified by his condition that she blocked the sight from her mind. I hadn't thought of that, but you might be right. He went to pour himself a glass of brandy. I think both the Comte de Provence and Marie-Thérèse were perfectly aware of the fact that Damien Pelletan was the son of the man who treated the Dauphin at the time of his death in the temple. Well, surely you can't think that's the reason Pelletan was killed? Who would murder a man for something his father did nearly 20 years ago? Isn't that what the revolutionaries did? They killed a 10-year-old boy for the sins of his forefathers. But Provence is far too fat and crippled to have done something like this. I'm not suggesting he did it himself, but he could certainly have hired someone. Someone such as the gentleman who tried to kill me outside of Stoke Mandeville. I can't believe it of him. I notice you don't say the same thing about Marie-Thérèse. She started to say something, then stopped and bit her lip. You can't, can you? Said Sebastian. Hero shook her head. There's much about Marie-Thérèse that I admire. She survived a terrible ordeal and suffered a brutal succession of heart-wrenching sorrows. That she came through it with anything even vaguely resembling sanity is truly remarkable. But for all that, I still cannot like her. It isn't just the haughtiness or the rigidity or the ostentatious, intolerant piety. Someone once described Marie-Thérèse to me as a consummate performer, and I suspect that she truly is. To my knowledge, no one has ever seen her looking happy, although you also never see her appear anything but calm in public. Yet I've been told that in reality she is anything but calm. She has hysterics. She's been known to faint at the sight of a barred window, and she trembles violently at the beat of a drum or the peal of a church bell. She has never really recovered from what was done to her. And while no one could ever in any way hold that against her, I still don't trust her. I wouldn't trust either her sincerity or her sanity. Sebastian was silent for a moment. Then he said, La Chapelle told me something else. He said that as part of the autopsy, the boy's heart was removed. Hero's gaze met his. Oh, God, she whispered. You think that's why Damien's killer stole his heart? In some twisted kind of revenge? I don't know. But what are the odds that Philippe Jean Pelletan would participate in an autopsy that removed the dead Dauphin's heart, only to have the heart of his own murdered son taken some 20 years later? What are the odds? Chapter 28. Monday, 25th of January. By morning, the temperature had risen a few degrees above freezing, the thaw turning the snow-filled streets of the city into thickly churned rivers of brown slush. But the wind was still icy cold, with a pervasive, bone-chilling dampness that sent market women scurrying down the footpaths with shawls drawn up over their heads and their shoulders hunched. Sebastian turned up the collar of his greatcoat and resisted the urge to stomp his cold feet. He was standing on the pavement outside the French Catholic chapel near Portman Square. The church had no bell tower, under a decree of King George III himself. Only a simple Latin cross set back into the facade helped differentiate it from the two stables flanking the plain brick building. But he could hear a rustling from within, and a moment later, as the Anglican church bells of the city began to chime the hour, a small huddle of older men and women, their bodies portly and dressed almost uniformly in black, exited the church's plain doors and drifted away. Sebastian stood with his hands clasped behind his back and waited. He'd heard it said that every morning of her life, Marie-Thérèse rose with the dawn, made her own bed, and swept her own room before devoting the next hour to prayer. It was what she had done each day of the more than 3 years she'd spent in a lonely prison cell in Paris, and she had never lost the practice. At Hartwell House she attended daily mass with her own chaplain, but in London she came here, to the French chapel, to pray with her fellow exiles. There were some who found the story of a king's daughter continuing to make her own bed admirable, and in a way it was, but to Sebastian it also spoke of the kind of deep and lingering trauma only too familiar to any man who had ever been to war. Somehow, Alone in her prison cell in the tower of the Knights Templars' ancient monastery, Marie-Thérèse had convinced herself that the daily practice of this homely ritual would keep her sane. It had. And so, even though she had now been free for nearly 20 years, she'd never dared to relax her self-imposed regime. It was as if the very act of making her bed and sweeping her room still kept the demons of madness at bay. Perhaps it did. The bells of the city had long since tolled into silence, but it was another 10 minutes before Marie-Thérèse herself made an appearance, trailed by her long-suffering companion, the Lady Giselle Edmondson. "Monsieur le Vicomte," said the king's daughter, her half-boots making soft, squishy noises in the slushy footpath. "This is unexpected." He swept a gracious bow. "Your uncle told me you decided to spend a few days in town." "Yes. As much as I enjoy the country, I find that I do miss the theatre." She cast him a speculative, sideways look. "Although I was disappointed to hear that Cat Boleyn is not treading the boards this season. She's always such a joy to watch, don't you agree?" An observer might have thought the remark entirely innocent, might have believed her ignorant of the fact that the actress Cat Boleyn had, for many years, been Sebastian's mistress. But he saw the spiteful gleam in her eyes, and he knew better. The jibe was both deliberate and breathtakingly malicious. "It is a pity, yes," he said, keeping his own voice bland with effort, "but understandable, given the circumstances of her late husband's recent death. One can surely appreciate her need to spend a few months away from the city, recovering from such a loss." "True." She sucked in her cheeks. "You wouldn't by chance know where she has gone?" "No," he said boldly. He did not, in truth, know where Cat had sought refuge, but wherever it was, he hoped she was finding the peace of mind she so desperately needed. A faint frown of disappointment pulled down the corners of the princess's lips, then was gone. She smoothed a hand over her pelisse. "So many murders. The streets of London are very dangerous, are they not?" "They certainly can be. I've been wondering, did you know that Dr. Damien Pelletan was the son of Philippe Jean Pelletan, the physician who treated your brother in the Temple prison?" Her lips flattened, and she shook her head determinedly from side to side. "No, I did not." For someone who had spent a lifetime dissembling, she was a terrible liar. He said, "That's not the real reason you decided to see Pelletan." "You dare!" A vicious snarl twisted her lips and quivered the tense muscles of her face. "You dare to contradict me, daughter of a king of France? Me, a descendant of the sainted Louis himself." Sebastian held her gaze. "Whoever killed Damien Pelletan also removed his heart. Do you have any idea why they would do that?" The violence of her reaction both surprised and puzzled him. Her eyes widened, and she gasped, one fist coming up to press against her lips. "Madame," said Lady Giselle, rushing forward to slip an arm around the Duchess's thick waist and urge her toward the waiting carriage. "Here, let me help you." She paused only to throw a piercing, furious glare over her shoulder at Sebastian. "You are despicable." A soft clapping of gloved hands echoed in the sudden stillness. Sebastian turned to find Ambrose Lachapelle slowly descending the steps from the chapel, his hands raised as if he were applauding a fine performance, the crook of a furled umbrella slung over one forearm. "Congratulations," said the courtier. "She'll never forgive you for that, you know. You have just broken one of the cardinal rules. One does not contradict a member of the French royal family, no matter how ridiculous or patently false their utterances may be. 15 years ago, a certain Madame Sonly ventured within Marie-Thérèse's hearing to correct the Comte de Provence's faulty memory of some trivial incident from their youth. Marie-Thérèse has still not forgiven the unfortunate woman, and she never will." Madame Rancune, said Sebastian, watching as in the distance Lady Giselle tenderly tucked a fur-lined robe around the Duchess. You have no idea. The two men turned together to walk up the street toward Portman Square. Sebastian said, Why did you attend Damien Peloton's funeral? I'm not sure. Out of respect, I suppose. Is that all? La Chapelle cast him a quick sideways glance. 18 years ago, the boy who was destined to be King Louis XVII of France died in a filthy prison cell at the age of 10. Yet even before his body was consigned to an anonymous grave in some forgotten churchyard, the rumours had already begun to fly. There is no denying that while the boy lived, there were several plots hatched to spirit the Dauphin away and replace him with another boy, a mute, dying of consumption. So after his death, it is inevitable that some would cling to the hope that one of those plots succeeded, that a switch was made, that the child who died in the temple was an impostor, and that the Dauphin himself still lives. What does any of this have to do with Damien Peloton? Few people alive today know the truth of what happened in the temple prison. Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan may be one of them. But the senior Pelletan is in France, beyond the Bourbons' ability to question him. There was hope that Damien Pelletan, the son, might know some of the events of those dark days, but he claimed he did not. Did the Bourbons believe him? Frankly, I doubt it. The two men walked on in silence for a moment. Then Sebastian said, You do realize that depending on where the truth lies, the House of Bourbon could conceivably have had two distinct motives for killing Damien Peloton. Two. The first, obviously, would be to disrupt the delegation from Paris, thus putting an end to the possibility of any peace accord that would leave Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of France. Such a peace will never come to pass, with or without Peloton's murder. Perhaps. But why take the chance? La Chapelle snorted. To even suggest that the French royal family would stoop to murder is absurd. To recover their kingdom? What is one more man's death when millions have already died? The Frenchman's jaw tightened. And your second so-called motive? Revenge? Seriously? For what? Damien Peloton's father was brought to the temple to treat the critically ill Dauphin. But the boy died anyway. One could conceivably fault the physician for his death. One would need to be brutal and cruel beyond measure to kill an innocent young man simply to avenge oneself on the man's father. And to cut out his heart, said Sebastian. They drew up at the edge of the square, and Sebastian turned to face the courtier. But the Frenchman simply shook his head and shifted his gaze to the elliptical gardens at the centre of the square, where children laughed and frolicked in the snow. Sebastian said, What are the chances that a substitution was made in prison, that the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lives? Ambrose La Chapelle shook his head. There is no lost Dauphin. I told you this tale to explain the interest of Provence and Marie-Thérèse in Dr. Pelletan. But there is no doubt in my mind that the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette is dead. He died 18 years ago, in prison, and lies buried in a pauper's grave in the churchyard of Sainte Marguerite. Believe me, monsieur, if you seek Damien Peloton's murderer, there is no need to delve so deeply into the events of the dark and distant past. There are plenty of motives to be found in the life the man was living here and now. Oh, such as? You have heard, I assume, of the fighting within the delegation from Paris? Yes. Have you never wondered why Damien Peloton agreed to come to London as Armand Vaudreuil's personal physician? I have heard. It was for love. For love? Repeated Sebastian. Vaudreuil's daughter, Madame Madeleine Quesnel, is a very attractive woman. She's with child, by her dead husband. She is, yes. But some women are never more beautiful than when they are with child. And she is, as you say, a widow. What precisely are you suggesting? That Peloton was murdered by a rival for Madame Quesnel's affections? You suggest that Damien Peloton's heart was removed because his father may once have removed the heart of the dead Dauphin. I find it more likely that he fell victim to a rival in an affaire de cœur. Sebastian studied the courtier's long, delicate face. The faint traces of last night's rouge were still visible in the pores of his skin. Why should I believe you? Lachapelle shrugged, as if whether Sebastian believed him or not was a matter of supreme indifference to him. Look into it. I think you might be surprised by what you learn. Then he turned and walked away, his furled umbrella twirling round and around as he softly hummed a familiar tune. It took Sebastian a moment to place the song. It was the Marseillaise. Chapter 29. Mitt Peebles was sweeping the melting snow from the footpath before the Gifford Arms when Sebastian walked up to him. "You again," said Mitt, wagging a finger at Sebastian. "I know who you are now, and I know why you was asking me all them questions." "Oh? Who told you?" "Nobody told me." He tapped his finger against his forehead, his head cocked sideways, as if pondering a great philosophical problem. "Done figured it out all by myself, I did." "Impressive." Sebastian lifted his gaze to the inn's symmetrical facade. "If you're looking for Armand Vondroy, he ain't here. Went off with the other two early this morning, he did. Most likely won't be back before mid-afternoon." "What about Monsieur Vondroy's daughter, Madame Quesnel?" "Oh, she's here, all right." Mitt jerked his head toward the rear of the inn. "There's a private garden out the back, gates by the stables. That's where you can usually find her. She likes to walk more than anybody I ever did see, and it don't matter the weather." "Thank you," said Sebastian, passing the man a coin. Mitt's face split into a huge grin. "Any time, your lordship, any time." Tucked away between the row houses of York Street and the recruit house that faced onto Birdcage Walk, the garden was irregular in shape, with its western end divided into 4 sections by paths that met at a wooden arbour covered with the thick, bare branches of an old wisteria. He found her there, one hand resting on the weathered wood beside her as she stared off over closely planted beds, still blanketed white by last night's fall of wet snow. She stood utterly still, and he had the impression her thoughts were far, far away, in both time and place. She wore a heavy black wool cloak that swelled gently over her rounded belly, and a close bonnet with a black velvet poke shielding her face. But at the sound of his approach she turned, her features registering surprise, but not alarm. "Madame Quesnel?" he asked, bowing. "My apologies for intruding. My name is Devlin." She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, with milky white skin and pretty, even features. "I know who you are," she said in a softly lilting accent. "My father pointed you out to me the other day. He says you are looking into the death of Damien Peloton. Is that true?" "I am, yes." "Good." "Somehow I get the impression your father doesn't exactly share your sentiments." "No, of course he does not. If anything, he is furious with Dr. Peloton for getting himself killed, as if he did it deliberately to sabotage Father's mission." Something of his reaction must have shown on her face, because she gave a wry smile and said, "You are surprised that I should mention Father's mission? I see no point in continuing a fiction when you already know the truth." "Thank you for that, at least." They turned to walk along a brick path that led toward the distant park. How long had you known Dr. Pelletan? Sebastian asked. 2, perhaps 3 years. Father began seeing him shortly after he developed heart problems. He credits Dr. Pelletan with keeping him alive, so he is taking this death quite personally. But not so personally as to try to help catch his physician's killer. My father's priorities are elsewhere. Sebastian studied her half-averted profile. What manner of man was he? Damien Pelletan. I doubt you will find anyone with anything harsh to say about him. He was everything you could wish for in a physician, and more. Gentle, kind. Her words were admiring, but he could detect nothing of the attitude of the lover in her manner. Do you know anything of his family in Paris? Sebastian asked. Does he leave a wife? She shook her head. No, he never married. What about a fiancé? Was he betrothed? No. A faint smile touched her eyes, then slowly faded, as if the memory his words had provoked was too sad to hold. He told me once that he fell in love at the age of 11, and swore never to love another. As did many of us, said Sebastian. It seldom endures. Perhaps. Although in Dr. Pelletan's case, he actually did remain faithful. What happened to the object of his love? Did she die? No. Her father was forced to flee France, and she had to go with him. She swore she would wait for Damien, but she did not. Sebastian stared out over the snow-covered garden, its careful plantings invisible beneath the anonymous hollows and bumps of the blanketing white. I take it she married someone else? Yes, some years ago. And yet he loved her still? He did. Always. Sebastian kept his voice level. Do you know the woman's name? Only her first name. He called her Julia. The gate slammed behind them, a sharp clang of metal against metal. Sebastian turned to see Armand Vondroy striding toward them, his gloved hands curled into fists that swung at his sides, his feet splayed out to keep from slipping on the slushy path. "You!" he shouted, his voice booming out when he was still some 20 or more feet away, one pointed finger coming up to punch the air between them. "What are you doing here? You stay away from my daughter, you hear? You stay away from her!" Sebastian touched his hat and bowed to the young widow. "Thank you for your assistance." He saw no shadow of fear in her eyes. Vondroy's noisy bluster obviously didn't frighten her. "I'd like to help in any way I can," she said quietly. "I want Damien Pelletan's killer brought to justice." Armand Vondroy's voice cut across the snow-filled garden. "Why are you here? What do you think my daughter can tell you that could possibly be of any use to you? Pelletan was set upon by footpads. You want to find his killers, go search for them in the stews and gutters of London, not here." Sebastian touched his hat again. "Monsieur." The Frenchman drew up, his puffy face red, his breath coming in wheezy gasps that billowed white around him as he glared silently back at Sebastian. Sebastian brushed past him on his way to the gate. "You stay away from my daughter!" Vondroy shouted after him. "You hear? Do you hear me?" Sebastian pivoted to face him again. "You're afraid of something." "What is it?" But Vondroy only clenched his jaw, his eyes bulging like those of a man who has just seen his worst nightmare come true. "So, Lady Peter lied to you," said Hero, one hand tucked through the crook of Sebastian's arm. It was just before noon, and they had come here to Hyde Park, for the kind of brisk walk Richard Croft frowned upon. What with the cold and the wet snow and the unfashionable hour, they essentially had the park to themselves. But the pathways were slippery enough that she was being very careful where she put her feet. Damien Pelletan and his Julia were considerably more than mere childhood friends. They were indeed. Although it's always possible she didn't realize just how deeply his affections were engaged.
She knew. She promised to wait for him.
True, but that was long ago. She may not have known that he was still in love with her. It's been 9 years since her family was forced to leave France. That's a long time.
Not for some men, Hero said quietly, and Sebastian felt his face grow hot, for he had loved Cat Boleyn for 8 long years and more, and Hero knew it. After a moment she said, "You think that is why Peloton decided to come to London, to see her again?"
"I'd say it's a strong possibility. Although it doesn't reflect well on him, given that she's been happily married for some years now."
"You don't know that she's happily married?" Sebastian thought about the bruises he'd seen on her arm, the black and blue imprints of an angry man's punishing fingers.
"You're right. I don't know. In fact, given what I know of Lord Peter Radcliffe, I suspect she's been unhappily married for most of those years."
Hero looked over at him. "I wonder if Damien Peloton knew that." Sebastian met her gaze.
"That's a question I intend to ask her."
Lady Peter Radcliffe was in Clifford's Lending Library in the Strand, reaching to put a slim blue volume back up on a high shelf, when Sebastian took it from her and slipped it into place.
"Allow me," he said.
"Thank you." She twisted her gloved hands around the strings of her reticule, her lovely eyes darting this way and that, as if in fear that they might be observed. Today she wore an elegant walking dress of jaconet muslin, with 3 piped flounces and a purple velvet spencer. But the gown was not quite in the latest style, and it occurred to Sebastian, looking at her, that Lord Peter's finances might not be in the best of order. He said quietly,
"I've discovered you haven't been truthful with me, Lady Peter."
Her lips parted with a quickly indrawn breath. "I don't know what you could possibly mean."
"Damien Peloton wasn't simply your childhood friend. He was once in love with you, as you were with him. When you left Paris, you promised to wait for him. Forever."
He expected her to deny it. Instead, she dropped her gaze to her hands and sank her teeth into her lower lip. "Forever is a long time," she said in a voice that was little more than a whisper. "Especially for a woman."
"Did you know he was still in love with you?"
She shook her head slowly back and forth, but he saw the telltale flush deepening in her cheeks and knew it for a lie. He said,
"I'm told Damien Peloton came to London because of a woman." "It was you, wasn't it?"
"No, please," she said hoarsely, her gaze lifting to his, pleading. "If my husband hears I've been seen talking to you, he'll—"
"Beat you."
All colour drained from her face. "No!"
"Damien Peloton came to London to see a woman. If not you, then who was it?" he pressed.
She backed away from him, her head still shaking from side to side. "His sister," she whispered. "He came here to see his sister."
"His sister? What sister?"
She stared at him as if his lack of knowledge took her by surprise. "Alexis." Sebastian could feel his pulse pounding in his throat.
"Are you telling me that Alexandrie Sauvage is Damien Peloton's sister?"
"Didn't you know?"
"No. No, I did not."
Chapter 30. Sebastian's loud knock at the surgery on Tower Hill was met with silence. Smothering an oath, he pounded on the house next door, expecting Gibson's housekeeper, Mrs. Federico, to answer. Instead, Gibson's door was opened by Alexis Sauvage herself. She stood with one hand on the latch, her face set in hostile lines, so that he thought for a moment that she might slam the door in his face. He said,
"Where is Gibson?"
"At St. Bartholomew's." He let his gaze rove over her. She wore the same worn grey walking dress from the night of her attack, although someone had obviously made an effort to clean the stains from its cloth. "You appear to be much better." "I am. I told Gibson this morning that I'm well enough to go home." "Yet you're still here," he said, pushing past her into the passageway. She closed the door with a snap and swung to face him. "He disagrees." Sebastian searched her face, the delicate cinnamon-dusted nose, the dark brown eyes, the high cheekbones, looking for some resemblance to the man he'd seen so briefly on Gibson's slab. He couldn't find it. She put one hand on her hip. "I understand you consider Paul Gibson your friend." "He is my friend, yes." "Why?" "Do you know your friend is an opium eater?" This was not the conversation Sebastian had come here intending to have. "I know he takes laudanum from time to time." "He has moved far beyond that." When Sebastian remained silent, she said, "You knew, yet you've done nothing." "What would you have me do?" "He's in pain, severe soul-corroding pain. As a physician, you of all people should understand that. Opium is how he deals with it." "It's killing him." "The pain would kill him." "There are things that can be done to help." "With the pain or with his opium He started to say addiction and changed it to problem. "Both." "I didn't come here to talk about Gibson. I want to know why the bloody hell you didn't tell us that Damien Pelleton was your brother." She held herself painfully straight. "How did you find out? Does it matter?" "I suppose not." She gave a small, peculiar shrug. "I recognized your voice that first night. I didn't tell you any more than I had to, because I don't trust you." "Because of Portugal?" "Of course." "Does that seem so difficult to believe?" He studied the signs of strain around her nostrils, the dark shadows in her eyes. But whether they were because of her recent illness, or because of the bitter memories his presence aroused, he couldn't have said. "Have you remembered anything more about what happened in Cat's Hole?" "Some, but not all." She swallowed. "I remember leaving Madame Bissette's room and walking back up the lane toward the tower. We were hoping to find a hackney there. It was so cold and dark, and Damien was nervous." "Nervous? Why?" "From the time he was a little boy, Damien always hated the dark." "So what happened?" "I thought I heard footsteps behind us. At first they were some distance away, but they kept getting closer. I turned to see who it was, and—" She broke off and shook her head. "That's the last thing I remember." He said, "Tell me about Samson Bullock." Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed. "How do you know of him?" "I know he threatened to kill you." "Why the hell didn't you think to mention him?" "But I did. At least to Gibson." "Bullock threatened me, not Damien. How could he possibly have anything to do with what happened?" "He holds you responsible for the death of his brother. And now I discover that Damien was your brother. We're talking about a man who grew up in the kind of family that names its children Samson and Abel. I can see him harboring some rather nasty biblical attitudes toward revenge." "An eye for an eye and a brother for a brother, is that what you're suggesting?" She tipped her head to one side as if considering it. "But Bullock had no way of knowing that Damien was my brother." "No one knows." "I know. So does the person who told me. Bullock could have found out." She shook her head. "No. Damien was killed because of his association with the delegation from Paris." "The number of people who knew about the peace negotiations is small." "Then that should make it easier to find those responsible." He searched her thin, pale face. He could see the lines left there by the harsh life she'd lived, by her recent injury, and the lingering fever she was still fighting. They had not moved from the passageway, but simply stood beside the door, old adversaries facing each other in the narrow, confined space. She leaned back against the wall, and though she would never admit it, he knew that simply being on her feet this long had tired her. She said, "Damien told me he was approached by a man who tried to bribe him."
"Bribe him? To what end?"
"Something to do with the delegation. He was frightened by the encounter. He feared both what the man might do to him for refusing, as well as what might happen if the others found out he'd been approached."
"Why didn't you tell me this before?"
When she simply stared back at him, he said,
"Your brother refused to cooperate."
A fierce light flared in the dark depths of her eyes. "Mon Dieu, of course he refused. What sort of a man do you think he was?"
"Who tried to bribe him?"
She frowned. "I can't recall his name precisely. I believe he was Scottish. Something like Kilmer or Kilminster or—"
"Kilmartin?"
"Yes, that was it," said Damien Peloton's sister. Kilmartin. Chapter 31. No man was a more reliable presence at the various soirees, balls, and breakfasts given by London's fashionable hostesses than Angus Kilmartin. Sebastian suspected Kilmartin worked such gatherings in much the same spirit as a pickpocket worked the crowds at a hanging, ever on the lookout for a new connection or a stray tidbit of information he could use to increase his personal wealth. Or perhaps he was simply driven by the need to show the world that a humble Glaswegian merchant's son was now wealthy and powerful enough to be invited almost anywhere. That afternoon's most fashionable must-attend event was a lavish Winter Wonderland-themed breakfast given by the Countess of Morley at her vast Grosvenor Square townhouse. Society breakfasts, like morning visits, were actually afternoon affairs, due to the fact that very few residents of Mayfair rolled out of bed before noon. When Sebastian walked up to him, Angus Kilmartin was contemplating the exquisite ice sculptures decorating Lady Morley's long buffet table. The Scotsman threw Sebastian a brief glance, then turned his attention to the array of delicacies spread out before him. "Didn't expect to see you here," said Kilmartin, helping himself to foie gras and toast. Sebastian lifted a glass of champagne from the tray of a passing waiter. "Oh? Why's that?" "You aren't exactly known for your fondness for social gatherings." "I do occasionally put in an appearance." But not, I suspect, without an ulterior motive. Am I to infer that I am your purpose?" Sebastian took a slow sip of his champagne. "As a matter of fact, you are. You lied to me." To call a gentleman a liar was the supreme affront to his honour, an insult that was traditionally met with a challenge to a duel. But Kilmartin merely let his gaze drift over the assembled throng, a bland smile on his comical, freckled face. "I lie all the time. I've never subscribed to the pathetic belief that we owe our fellow men the truth. An interesting philosophy. At least I'm honest about it." Sebastian gave a soft laugh. "True. I'm curious. What was Damien Peloton's reaction when you tried to bribe him?" Kilmartin brought his gaze back to Sebastian's face. His smile never slipped. "Heard about that, did you? Well, if you must know, he leapt at my offer." "What do you think? That he became righteously indignant and threatened to expose me, so that I had no option but to creep up behind him in a darkened alley and cut out his heart? Not his tongue, mind you. Surely a more fitting punishment for one with a tendency to talk too much. But his heart? Please spare me this drivel." Sebastian took another sip of his champagne and somehow resisted the impulse to dash the contents of his glass into the man's self-satisfied face.
What precisely did you want P.2 to do for you? He wasn't formally a part of the delegation. He was simply a physician.
Kilmartin rolled his eyes.
You don't have much of an imagination, do you?
Sebastian studied the Scotsman's bland smile. He could think of two services P.2 might have provided Kilmartin, one considerably nastier than the other. Kilmartin could have paid the physician to eavesdrop on the various members of the delegation and report their conversations back to him. Or he could have pressured P.2 to poison his own patient.
And did he perform as well as you anticipated? Sebastian asked.
Kilmartin heaved a heavy sigh.
Unfortunately, no. Someone else obviously got to him first. A statement meant to implicate whom? Armand Vondroy himself?
Kilmartin's smile spread into something wide and toothy.
Far be it for me to encroach on your self-appointed avocation as a crusader for justice, but you do seem to require a helpful nudge in the right direction. Your generosity overwhelms me.
Kilmartin splayed one hand over his chest and gave a mocking bow.
I must confess that's not something I hear every day.
Philanthropy,
like honesty, not being a belief to which you subscribe.
Exactly. Kilmartin's pale eyes glinted with malice masquerading as amusement.
But he seemed to be feeling unusually generous today, so I'll give you another little hint to the wise. Don't make the mistake of giving too much credence to P.2's sister. She has her own secrets she's most anxious to hide. How do you know Damien P.2 had a sister?
Kilmartin laughed.
Information is a valuable commodity, and I like to trade in valuable commodities. Information can also be quite dangerous.
For one intense moment, the Scotsman's smile slipped. Then he pressed his lips together, the ends of his mouth curling up, his chin dimpling as he pulled it back in a grimace.
Only to those without the resources to use it correctly.
He gave a low, mocking bow and said,
My lord.
Sebastian was watching Kilmartin weave his way through the crowd when he became aware of a stout, grey-haired, fierce-eyed dowager bearing down upon him. She was the Dowager Duchess of Claiborne, born Lady Henrietta St. Cyr, sister to the current Earl of Hendon, and, as far as the world knew, Sebastian's aunt. Now, over 70, Henrietta had never been a beauty, but she had a regal presence, a brutal will, and a tenacious memory that made her a force to be reckoned with in society. By far her most attractive feature was the startlingly vivid eyes that were the hallmark of her family, the blue, sincere eyes so noticeably lacking in Sebastian.
"Aunt," said Sebastian, stooping to brush her cheek with a kiss.
She was wearing a puce satin gown, trimmed in pale pink, with an extraordinarily hideous headpiece of towering striped satin ornamented with a bouquet of pink and puce-coloured feathers. He stepped back, eyes widening as if in rapt admiration. "What a particularly fetching turban. You're one of the few women I know who can carry off the colour puce. And with pink, no less." She swatted at him. "Ah, think to turn me up sweet, do you? Well, let me tell you right now, it won't work. I know why you're here." "You do?" "I do. Hendon told me you've involved yourself in this dreadful new murder." Sebastian held himself very still. "What does Hendon know of it?" "More than you might think," she said vaguely. "What does that mean?" She worked her lips back and forth in a way that reminded him of her brother. "He's worried about True Devlin. I see no reason why he should be. He heard about the attack near Stoke Mandeville." "Oh? And then he saw fit to edify you with the tale?" "No. That was Claiborne. Claiborne was Henrietta's long-suffering son and the current Duke of Claiborne.
How very busy of him.
Claiborne has always been very busy. It's a tendency he inherited from his father. Sebastian laughed out loud, for he'd known few men more taciturn than Henrietta's late husband, the third Duke of Claiborne. Henrietta, on the other hand, rivaled Jarvis in her ability to ferret out the secrets and scandals of the various members of the Haute Tonne, although, unlike Jarvis, she was driven solely by a boundless curiosity about her fellow beings. She fixed him with a level stare. "I take it you're not coming to my soirée on Tuesday night? As usual?"
"No."
She sniffed. "How does your wife?"
"She is well, thank you. Quite well.
I chanced to see her in Berkeley Square a few days ago. Any possibility she might be carrying twins?" Sebastian gave a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears.
"No. No chance of that."
"No?"
"That explains a few things,"
she said cryptically, then deliberately moved away before he could challenge her on the statement. Chapter 32. Paul Gibson trudged up the hill toward home, his gaze on the sombre bulk of the tower looming before him. The light was fading rapidly from the sky, leaving the ancient battlements silhouetted against the darkening clouds. He could feel the temperature dropping with each step, the icy wind chafing his cheeks and freezing his nostrils as he sucked in air. But that didn't stop a thin layer of sweat from forming on his forehead. The sense of unease that had dogged him for blocks was growing ever more oppressive with each step. It was as if he could feel someone behind him, their eyes boring into his back. Finally, when he could bear it no longer, he whipped around. "Who's there?" he cried to the nearly empty street, only to feel more than a wee bit foolish as he looked into the beady eyes of a dirty white hen that stopped mid-peck to raise her head and stare at him. Straightening his shoulders, he self-consciously adjusted the set of his coat and continued up the hill, his peg-leg tap-tapping hollowly with each step. He tried to tell himself he was tired, worn down by the events of the last several days, and bedevilled by the wispy remnants of last night's laudanum. Yet the feeling of being watched remained. It was with a sigh of relief that he saw the golden glow of candlelight shining through the front windows of his house. He pushed open his front door and breathed in the rich aroma of a hearty stew. Leaning back against the closed door, he squeezed his eyes shut and tried to still the heavy pounding of his heart. Alexis Sauvage was right, he thought. Those damn poppies were going to kill him at the rate he was going. Kill him, or steal what was left of his mind. The sound of a soft step on the worn flagging of the passage made him open his eyes. She stood before him, a slim, fiery-haired woman, dressed in a gown of mossy green he'd never seen before. "You should be resting," he said. She shook her head. "I'm tired of resting. I'm better, truly I am. Besides, someone needed to fix your supper." "My supper?" He frowned. "Where the He started to say devil, but caught himself just in time. "Dickens is Mrs. Federico?" "I'm afraid your housekeeper has a rather low opinion of the French." "She what?" "She promised to return tomorrow, after I'm gone." He became aware of the bundle of her things resting just inside the door, and its significance hit him so hard it nearly took his breath. "You're leaving?" "I sent for Carmela. She's gone to fetch us a hackney. But I wanted to stay long enough to tell you goodbye." She took the 2 steps necessary to close the distance between them. For one glorious moment he thought she meant to kiss him, and he told himself he was 6 kinds of an Irish fool. She rested her palms on the front of his coat. He could feel the heat of her hands against his chest, feel his heart pounding against his ribs. Then she tipped her head to brush her lips against his ever so softly, before taking a step back again. Her hands fell to her sides.
"There simply are no words adequate for the task of thanking someone who has saved your life," she said. "But I don't know what else to say except merci."
Somehow he found enough breath to answer her.
"You don't need to be going yet." "Yes, I do."
Her gaze met his.
"And you know why, as well as I do."
A long silence drew out between them, filled with their measured breathing and words best left unspoken.
He said, "What about that man, the one who was watching you last night?" "Bullock," she shrugged. "I can handle Bullock." She was so bloody brave and stubborn she frightened him. "And Amion Peloton's killer?" he asked, his voice rough with the force of his emotions. "Can you handle him too?"
She lifted her chin in that way she had.
"I refuse to live my life in fear. But I will be careful, I promise."
The rattle of a trace chain and the clatter of hooves on the cobbles outside announced the arrival of her hackney. She stooped to catch up her bundle and reached for the latch. Then she paused to look back at him.
"I meant what I said last night. You don't need to live with the pain from your missing leg. I can help you. There's a trick that uses a box and mirrors to fool the mind into—" He shook his head. "No." "And you call me stubborn?"
She jerked open the door. The hackney was old and broken down and smelled of mouldy hay and spilled ale. Gibson was conscious of her woman, Carmela, scowling at him from the vehicle's interior, her arms crossed beneath her massive breasts as he handed Alexei up into the carriage. He wished he could say something, anything, to stop this moment and hold her in his life. But the Jarvey was already cracking his whip. The carriage rolled forward. He raised one hand in an awkward gesture of farewell, but she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. Her hair, a bright flame, lost all too soon in the gloom of the night. It wasn't until she was gone that he realized he hadn't actually called her stubborn. He'd only thought it. The impulse to lose himself in opium-sweet embraces was strong enough to propel Gibson away from Tower Hill that night. Resisting a secondary urge to seek a coarser type of oblivion at his local pub, he caught a hackney to Mayfair and met Devlin at a quiet coffee-house in Hanover Square. "I can look at your face and see that you haven't brought me good news," said Devlin, ordering coffee for them both. Gibson eased out a soft sigh as he settled in a chair near the fire, glad to get off his peg leg. "Part of the problem is Richard Croft. He's been very busy going about justifying himself to anyone and everyone who'll listen. Technically, I suppose he could claim he's been discreet. But it's amazing how much a man can somehow manage to convey without actually saying it. Most people are wise enough to discern the truth, that Croft resigned because he feared Jarvis's wrath should something go wrong. But rather than helping matters, that's probably only made the situation worse. All I need is one name," said Devlin, leaning his forearms on the table between them. Gibson wrapped his cold-numbed hands around his steaming coffee. "Well, my colleague Lothan has offered to consult with Lady Devlin. But to be frank, I don't think he'll find favour with her any more than Croft did, less so, in fact. If anything, he's worse than Croft when it comes to the employment of bloodletting, purges, and emetics, and he absolutely refuses under any circumstances to use forceps, which, I'm afraid, may become necessary in this case." Devlin listened to him in silence, his lean, handsome face looking unnaturally bleak and hollow-eyed. "So what do you suggest?" Gibson took a sip of the coffee and burned his tongue. "There are a few men I still haven't managed to contact yet, but if worst comes to worst—" He paused, drew a deep breath, and said, "What about Alexandre Sauvage?
She's a physician and an accoucheur, and she— No.
Gibson dropped his gaze to his steaming cup. He knew he should tell Devlin that Alexei had left his surgery and returned to Golden Square, but somehow his throat closed up at the very thought of even trying to talk about it. He said instead, "Have you learned anything more about the men who attacked you outside Stoke Mandeville?"
No. I had a message from Sir Henry a bit ago saying his constables came up empty-handed at the livery stables. But I'm not surprised. Whoever we're dealing with here isn't careless enough to leave a clear trail. Seems to me the two aren't necessarily linked. Peloton's murder and the attack on you, I mean. It could be that you're making someone connected to either the Bourbons or the peace initiatives nervous. I've no doubt my questions are making a lot of people uncomfortable.
A silence fell between them, both men lost in their own thoughts. After a moment, Devlin said,
"What are the chances the babe could still turn? Give me an honest answer, Gibson."
Gibson forced himself to meet his friend's gaze.
"In truth, they're small. But it is possible. I've known babes to turn within hours of a confinement."
Devlin nodded silently. But the look in his eyes was that of a man staring into the yawning abyss of hell. Chapter 33. That night, in his dreams, Sebastian breathed again the familiar scent of orange blossoms. Except this time the laughing shouts of the children were far away, like a haunting portent of things to come. This time he felt the sharp edge of a too-tight rope biting deep into the flesh of his wrists, and a hot, sticky wetness that trickled down the side of his face from the gash near his eye. The moonlight was the colour of bleached pewter, the air frigid with a sudden chill that darkness can bring to the mountains even after a warm spring day. He sat with his legs sprawled awkwardly before him, his bound hands wrenched painfully behind his back. The ground beneath him was bare, hard-packed earth. A fitful wind bent the crooked limbs of the trees overhead and filled the night with dancing, grotesque shadows. He could smell wood smoke and the tantalizing aroma of roasting meat, hear the murmured voices of tired soldiers. The burnt-out shell of what had once been a gracious villa sprawled nearby, its empty arched windows glowing orange from the light of scattered campfires, kindled within the lee of its protective stone walls. The woman was careful not to get too close to him. Her skin was kissed golden by the sun, her hair a halo of fire in the night. She wore the rough trousers and rugged shirt of a Spanish peasant, with a bandolier slung across the fullness of her breasts. She looked like a Spanish guerrillero, but she was not. She was French, like the men who had captured him. She said, "He won't let you die easily." Sebastian gave her a smile that was supposed to be cocky, but thanks to his split lip and swollen face, probably came out lopsided. "Is that why you're here? To spare me the delights your Major Rousseau has planned for me in the morning? Out of the goodness of your heart, I assume?" Her eyes narrowed. "Your colonel betrayed you. You do realize that, don't you?" He deliberately widened his smile and felt the cut at the corner of his mouth crack open and bleed again. "I don't believe you." "Then you are a fool." "Most men are, sooner or later." She'd been hunkered down before him, arms draped over her knees, in the posture of one who has spent many nights around a campfire. Now she pushed to her feet. "It doesn't need to end this way." "With my death? I think that's a foregone conclusion." "True. Yet death can come with agonizing, unbearable slowness, or it can come quickly, when there is no need to prolong it." Sebastian forced himself to hold her gaze, his voice calm, although his guts were roiling with the knowledge of the horror her words promised. "I'll think about your offer." "Don't think too long." She took a step back, then another and another, careful not to turn away until she was far beyond his reach, as if there weren't 2 guards with their muskets trained on him, as if he weren't tied up like a hog ready for slaughter. The pounding of the blood in Sebastian's ears had grown so loud that he could no longer hear the rush of the wind through the cedars overhead, or the melancholy song of a lark heralding the coming of the day. Then he opened his eyes to find a familiar room filled with the soft light of early dawn. He turned his head to see Hero asleep beside him, her dark hair tumbled around her face, her lashes long and dark against the flesh of her cheeks. Yet the emotions from the distant past remained so intense that he had to suck in a deep, shaky breath in an attempt to ease them. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his curled fists pressing into the softness at his sides. He felt Hero's splayed hand warm against the small of his bare back. "Bad dreams again?" she asked quietly. "Yes." He rose to his feet. She watched him walk across the room. "Going someplace?" "I want to talk to Alexandre Sauvage's woman again." She pushed up on her elbow. "At this hour?" "The sun's nearly up." "Devlin." He turned to look back at her. "When you knew Alexandre Sauvage before, in Portugal, was she your lover?" He went to kneel beside her on the bed, his knees denting the mattress at her hip, his gaze locked with hers. "No. I killed her lover." "Why?" "Because otherwise he would have killed me." "Then she can't blame you for it?" "If she killed me, even in self-defense, would you blame her for it?" Hero didn't even blink. "Yes, forever." Tuesday, 26th of January. The frigid morning air smelled of coal smoke and fresh horse droppings and roasting coffee. Sebastian pushed his way through the early crush of apprentices, tradesmen, and women wrapped in their warmest shawls, with the handles of market baskets looped over their arms, their breath showing white in the misty air. Heavy grey clouds pressed down on the city, obscuring the feeble light of the rising sun, and promising more snow or a biting sleet. He was crossing the square toward Alexi's house when one of the women he'd spoken to before, a street vendor, called out to him from behind her stall. "She's back, you know." Sebastian paused beside the stall, the warm odour of eel pies rising from the tray before him. "You mean Madame Sauvage?" "Aye. Come back just last night, she did. Got a big gash on the side of her head, just here." She tilted her head and put up a hand encased in a darned wool glove to touch the matted grey hair above her ear. "Says she don't know who done it, but we all know." "Oh? Who's that?" "That cabinet maker, Bullock. That's who. Any fool could see that." "You mean the man who holds her responsible for the death of his brother?" "That's right." "And how precisely does he blame her for the death of a man who succumbed to jail fever?" "She's the one accused Abel Bullock of murder, she did." "Whom had he murdered?" "His own wife, that's who. Mattie was her name. Now, I'm not saying she were anything like an angel. She had a tongue on her could blister the hide off a mule, and she was a bit too fond of the gin, if you know what I mean. But then, what woman wouldn't be, if she had to put up with the likes of Abel Bullock?" "What happened?" Sebastian asked. "Mattie come to Madame Sauvage one night, maybe 3-4 weeks ago. A sight she was, with both eyes black, and a split lip, and hurting so bad she could hardly walk. Madame Sauvage had delivered Mattie's last babe, you see, so I guess Mattie figured she could trust her. Claimed she'd tumbled down the stairs, but any fool could take one look at her and see she'd been worked over by a man's fist. Kicked her, too, right in her belly. Madame Sauvage did what she could, but some things can't be fixed. Died, she did. Something ruptured inside her." "There was an inquest?" "Aye. Problem was the Bullock brothers. They both swore she'd fallen down them steps." I know there was plenty what heard her screaming, and Abel cursing her and eating on her. Folks was too scared to step forward and say it."
"Afraid of the Bullock brothers, you mean?"
The woman dropped her voice and leaned forward, her eyes opened so wide he could see the white rimming her grey irises. "Matty weren't the first them two have killed."
"So what happened?"
Madame Sauvage came forward, said there weren't no doubt but what Matty had had a beating, and that before Matty breathed her last, she said her husband had done it."
"And the coroner believed her?"
"She was real persuasive, she was. They committed Abel to Newgate to stand trial, not for manslaughter, but murder."
"He died of jail fever before he came to trial?" asked Sebastian, his head tipping back as he studied the attic windows in the Dutch-like roofline of the corner house.
"He did. And ever since, Samson Bullock's been telling anyone who'll listen that he's going to make her pay. He says—" She broke off, her mouth sagging open, her head turning as a low rumble reverberated across the square. Sebastian saw a flash of light behind the windows on the 4th floor of the corner house. A concussive blast shattered the morning calm, splintering windows and sending roof tiles and singed rafters exploding upward on a massive white plume of billowing smoke. Then a hail of gritty dust and glass and burnt debris rained down on the screaming crowd in the square. Chapter 34. His breath coming harsh and fast, Sebastian tore up the stairs. He paused on the second landing to yank off his cravat and tie it around his mouth and nose. From above came the crackle of flames biting into dry old wood, and the roar of a combustion so fierce he could feel the draught on the sweat of his forehead. Somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floors, he came upon a little girl in a singed pinafore, her fair curls framing a pallid, smudged face. He scooped her up, her limp hand dangling as he plunged back downstairs with her. He was aware of grim-faced men pushing past him up the stairs, some armed with axes, others carrying flexible leather hoses clamped together with brass fittings. He stumbled out into the rubble-strewn misty square to find it filled with screaming women and shouting men, and the clanging bells of the engines, each with a pair of men frantically working the cross-handles to pump water from their cisterns. He started across the pavement toward the square's central gardens, rubble and broken glass crunching beneath his feet, and heard someone scream, "Georgina!" The child in his arms stirred, and he turned to see a woman, tears streaming down her blackened face. A muslin gown hanging in dirty tatters stumbled toward him with arms outstretched. "Georgina! Oh, thank God!" Surrendering the child to her mother, Sebastian pushed his way back across the street. Someone handed him a tankard of ale, and he paused to gulp it down thankfully. He was giving it back to a buxom woman with a tray when his gaze fell on the body of Alexei Sauvage's Basque servant Carmela, lying on the pavement where someone had left her, so blackened and shattered he didn't need a second look to know she was dead. Bloody hell! Swiping his sleeve across his face, he headed back into the house, just as a tall, skinny man with a nasty gash across his forehead stumbled out the door to croak, "Ain't nobody left alive in there." Sebastian grabbed his arm as he passed. "You're certain?" The man stared at him mutely and nodded, red-rimmed eyes pale in a black, sweat-streaked face. Sebastian let his head fall back, his gaze raking the top of the house. Feather-light streaks of black ash were still falling from out of the misty grey sky, but the flames had subsided, leaving the air thick with the pungent stench of wet, burned wood. He tore off the cravat he'd shoved back down around his neck and used it to wipe his face. 6 years in the army had given him a painful familiarity with gunpowder explosions. He had no doubt as to what he had just witnessed, just as he had no doubt that Alexandre Sauvage had been the intended target. The blast had been sighted directly beneath her rooms. What kind of monster could, without hesitation or remorse, Risk killing or maiming an entire house full of innocent men, women, and children simply to murder one woman? Who would do something like that? And why? He glanced back at Carmela's body to see a young woman with a halo of dark red hair kneeling on the pavement beside her, one charred hand cradled in her lap, her head bowed as if in silent prayer. An empty market basket rested on the pavement beside her. Sebastian walked up to her, not stopping until the toes of his hessians nearly touched the worn, mossy green gown puddled on the debris-strewn pavement around her. He watched her stiffen, her gaze lifting slowly from his boots to his face. "I thought you were dead," he said. She shook her head. "The cold, damp weather always makes Carmela's rheumatism act up. I offered to go buy the bread this morning." He hunkered down beside her, his gaze hard on her face. "If you know anything that might explain who is doing this, or why, you must tell me." Her face was ashen pale, the sprinkle of cinnamon across the high bridge of her nose standing out stark as she lifted her gaze to the fire-blackened bricks of the roofline above them. "What makes you think this was directed at me? It could have been an accident." "This was no accident. It was a small charge of gunpowder deliberately staged in the rooms directly beneath yours. What do you know about the tenant on the floor below you?" She shook her head. "Last I heard, the rooms were empty. There was an old widow, a Mrs. Goodman, but she died a week or so ago." She fell silent, her gaze coming to rest again on her woman. He said softly, "Are you all right?" She swallowed hard. Yes. But he knew what she was thinking, that this was all somehow ultimately her fault, that she had caused Carmela's death. He said, "How long ago did you leave the building?" "Just minutes before the explosion. I was crossing Brewer Street when I heard it." "It's possible you left right after the killer set the fuse. You didn't notice anyone strange as you were leaving?" "No." She cast a quick, probing glance at the crowd of people milling about them. "Are you saying whoever did this could still be here?" Sebastian let his own gaze drift around the rubble-strewn square thronged now with gawkers. Whoever lit that fuse would have wanted to be well away from the building itself before the powder blew. But I doubt he went far. He'd want to be here to see it, and to make certain nothing went awry. "But something did go awry," she said, her voice a husky rasp. "I am still alive." He brought his gaze back to her face. "Why would someone want to kill you? Not Damien Peloton, but you." "I do not know. Mother of God, you think I would not tell you if I did?" He held her furious gaze for one long moment. "Yes." Jules Calhoun let out a pained sigh. "I may be able to salvage the buckskins, my lord," he said, "but the coat and the waistcoat are hopelessly ruined, and the cravat." "Sorry," said Sebastian, pulling a clean shirt over his head. "And your boots. I fear they may never be the same again. If anyone can save them, you can." Calhoun made an inelegant noise deep in his throat. Sebastian said, "When you were asking around Tichborne Street about Bullock, did anyone mention whether or not he had a military background?" Calhoun looked up from the boots. "I don't believe so, no." "Why?" "He has what looks like a scar from a saber slash across his cheek. I'd be interested to know if he spent some time in the army, and if so, with what sort of a unit." "You think Bullock could have set that gunpowder to explode?" "I'd find it difficult to believe he has the requisite knowledge, unless there's something in his background we don't know about." Calhoun turned toward the door, the charred clothes held in one extended hand. "I'll see what I can find, my lord."
Calhoun."
The valet paused to look back at him.
"Be careful."
The conviction that Alexandre Sauvage was hiding something remained. And so, that afternoon, Sebastian went to see one of the few people he knew in London who was familiar with her, and still alive. He'd no doubt that Claire Bisset had honestly told him all she could remember of Alexi's visit to her lodgings that night with Damien Pelletan. But a woman raw with grief over her child's recent death was unlikely to make a reliable witness. He found Cat's Hole crowded with beggars and seamen, and vendors selling everything from pickled eggs and salted herrings to cracked old shoes and mended tin pots. The air was thick with the smell of the river and overflowing bog houses and unwashed humanity. His knock on the door at the end of the corridor of Hangman's Court went unanswered for so long he was beginning to think Claire Bisset had moved away. Then the door swung slowly inward, to reveal the sad-eyed woman he remembered from the other night. "I'm sorry to bother you again," he said, removing his hat, "but I wonder if I might ask you a few more questions about the night Dr. Damien Pelletan was killed." He realized she was younger than he'd first taken her to be, probably closer to 30 than 40. She had her dark blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun, and the wild look of unimaginable anguish he remembered had been replaced by a quiet kind of hopeless despair that was, in its own way, even more heartbreaking to witness. She nodded and stepped back to allow him to enter. "Monsieur?" The room was as cold and forlorn as it had been the first time Sebastian had seen it. And he knew, without being told, that she had spent the money he had given her not on fuel or food for herself, but on securing a proper burial for her dead child. As if aware of the drift of his thoughts, she squared her shoulders with a ghost of pride and said, "What was it you wished to know?" "I realize this might be a difficult question to answer, since you'd never met Damien Pelletan before that night, but did he seem at all agitated in any way? Angry? Or perhaps even afraid for some reason?" Her eyes narrowed. Instead of answering, she said, "How is Alexis Sauvage?" The question was not the non-sequitur it might have seemed. "She is much improved. Unfortunately, the blow to her head has affected her memory. She recalls little from that night, which is why I was hoping you might be able to help us piece together what happened and why." The Frenchwoman continued to stare at him for a moment longer, but the answer seemed to satisfy her. She went to stand at a small cracked window overlooking the dark, narrow courtyard below. "I found him a most gentle, generous man, and he could not have been kinder to me, but—" "But?" prompted Sebastian. "Since your last visit, I've been trying to recall everything that was said that night. He and the doctoress were arguing, and I don't mean about Cécile." "Do you remember what about?" "The conversation was held in undertones, but I heard enough to understand that the disagreement was over a woman. Not a patient, but someone from Dr. Pelletan's personal life." "A woman?" She nodded. "I had the impression the woman was someone from his past, who is now wed to another. I could be wrong. It was all said in whispers, and I was so very distracted. But I had the impression he wanted this woman to leave her husband." "And Alexandre Sauvage thought that would be a mistake?" "She did, yes." "Did she say why?" "If she did, I did not hear it." "When your child is ill—" Her voice trailed away. Claire Bisset was a woman whose life had been crowded with unimaginable hardships and sorrows. For the sake of her child she had kept going, struggling every day to find food, to survive. But now, with Cécile dead, it was as if something had died within her, too. And Sebastian knew it was her will to live. He said, "When was the last time you ate?" She shook her head. "I don't know. It does not matter." "It does." He removed one of his cards from his pocket and held it out to her.
My wife is due to be confined shortly, and is in need of a nursemaid for our first child. She would prefer to engage someone older and better educated than those typically sent by the employment agencies. I realize that such a position is far below the station to which you were once accustomed, but it is a beginning." Rather than take the card, she shook her head, one hand running self-consciously down the side of her ragged, old-fashioned gown. "I could not possibly present myself to your wife looking like this." "A lack of proper clothing is easily remedied, unlike deficiencies in education, experience, and character." When she refused to take the card, he laid it on the wooden mantel of the cold hearth. "I'll tell Lady Devlin to expect you," he said, and then left before she could hand it back to him. Sebastian tried to remember what Alexandre Sauvage had told him about Lady Peter Radcliffe. But when he thought about it, he realized he couldn't recall having discussed the beautiful, sad-eyed Frenchwoman with Damien Peloton's sister at all. When she'd been fighting for her life in the after-effects of concussion and possible pneumonia, he could understand the omission. But he found it difficult to believe that a woman truly interested in finding her brother's killer would fail to disclose his dangerous interest in another man's wife. Lady Peter's reasons for failing to reveal the true extent of her involvement with the young French doctor were considerably easier to understand. Lord Peter Radcliffe's beautiful French-born wife was watching her little brother race two gaily coloured wooden sailboats across the narrow strip of ornamental water in Green Park when Sebastian walked up to her. A blustery wind scuttled a tumble of grey clouds overhead, sending shifting patterns of light and shadow across the ruffled surface of the water, and billowing the cloth sails of the crudely fashioned boats. "Noel," Lady Peter called, laughing, "I think the blue one is going to win." Then she froze, the merriment dying from her eyes as she turned her head to see Sebastian. She wore a fur-trimmed pelisse of dark hunter green wool, made high at the throat and long in the sleeves, and it occurred to Sebastian that even on balmy days she invariably stayed away from styles that revealed too much of her skin. But nothing could disguise the livid bruise that rode high on her left cheekbone. Chapter 35. Lady Peter stood very still, only her shoulders jerking with the agitation of her breathing as she watched Sebastian walk up to her, and he found himself wondering why she feared him so much. She said, "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" "Only some information about Damien Peloton." He shifted his gaze to the mock naval race before them. "Who made the boats, Lord Peter?" She shook her head. "Noel. He has ambitions to go to sea." "It can be a lucrative career," said Sebastian. "It can also be a deadly one, even when England is not at war, as it is now." "England will always be at war with someone somewhere." "True." He was aware of her gaze lifting from the boats to his face. "But you didn't come here to discuss my brother's future career options, did you, Lord Devlin?" He watched the two boats skim across the choppy surface of the water. "You told me you grew up next door to Damien Peloton in Paris." "Yes," she said warily, obviously unsure where he was going with this. "How well did you know his sister Alexei?" "Alexei?" She let out her breath in a soft sigh, as if relieved by the seemingly innocuous direction of the conversation. "Not well. She was 6 years older than I, and very serious. She always dreamt of becoming a physician. She had little use for dolls or needlework or silly little girls like me." "She went to the University of Bologna to study?" Lady Peter nodded. "She was just 16. Dr. Philippe had an uncle there, and she went to stay with him." "What do you know of her first husband? Beauclair, wasn't it?" "Yes. He was a physician as well. I never knew him. I believe they met in Bologna, when he joined the Grande Armée
Alexei went with him.
He was killed?
Yes. She watched Noël run along the water's edge, shouting encouragement to first one boat, then the other. Why are you asking me these questions about Alexei?
I'm wondering why she would take such care to preserve your secret.
Lady Peter turned her head to look at him, her breath leaving her body in an odd forced laugh. Secret? What secret?
Damien Pelleton didn't come to London to see his sister, did he? He came to see you. Did he come here intending to try to convince you to leave England and go back to France with him? Or was that a decision he reached only after he saw you?
The new bruise stood out starkly against the ashen pallor of her face. No, I've no idea what you're talking about.
You said Damien Pelleton came to dinner one evening and paid you a few formal calls.
Yes.
Then how did he come to know Noël?
Children, traditionally, made no appearance at formal meals or visits. She stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. I don't understand.
You told me that on the morning of his death last Thursday, you saw Pelleton in the park arguing with Kilmartin. You said Noël called out to Damien and would have run to him if you hadn't stopped him. That suggests Noël not only knew Damien Pelleton, but that he considered him a friend. How did your little brother come to know him so well? Rather than answer, she looked out over the wind-wrinkled water, her throat working painfully as she swallowed. Did Lord Peter find out about Damien? Sebastian asked quietly. Is that why he hit you?
My husband does not beat me, she said with awful dignity.
Where did you get the bruise on your face, Lady Peter?
One gloved hand crept up to touch her cheek, then fluttered self-consciously away. I tripped. It was the silliest thing. I tripped and smacked my face against the side of a bureau.
Sebastian watched Noël run around to the far bank to try to catch his boots. Does Lord Peter know that you and Damien Pelleton were once considerably more than childhood friends?
She shook her head.
So he didn't realize that Pelleton was still in love with you?
No. He didn't know anything, I swear it.
She started to touch her bruise again. Then, as if becoming aware of what she was about to do, she curled her hand into a fist and dropped it to her side. In England, a husband was legally empowered to beat his wife. He was expected to restrain himself to gentle chastisement, but the forces of the law usually looked the other way, unless he so far forgot himself as to kill the poor hapless woman. Even then he could frequently plead manslaughter and get away with a simple burning on the hand. The law was not always so tolerant of a jealous husband who killed a real or imagined rival for his wife's affections.
Lady Peter said, There is something I did not tell you.
Oh?
She bit her lip, her gaze sliding away from him as if frantically calculating how much to tell him and how much to keep hidden. You're right. I did see Damien more frequently than I admitted before. Perhaps more than I ought to have. He reminded me so much of happier days, of springtime along the Seine, when my parents were still alive and I was young and carefree.
And?
Damien would sometimes meet Noël and me here in the park. I last spoke to him late Wednesday afternoon, the day before he died. I knew as soon as I saw him just how upset he was.
Did he tell you why?
At first he tried to shrug it off, saying the constant quarrelling among the various members of the delegation was becoming tiring. But he finally admitted he discovered something that troubled him, something about Vondreuil.
About Vondreuil's health?
No. Damien told me once that Vondreuil's heart is nowhere near as bad as Vondreuil believes it to be, that if he would only eat sensibly and drink in moderation, he would in all likelihood live to a ripe old age. She watched Noël hunker down to retrieve his boots. Whatever worried him involved the peace negotiations. He told me he was considering approaching Colonel Fouché with what he knew.
Do you think he did?
I don't know. He may have decided instead to confront Vondroy directly. Sebastian studied her flawless profile, the exquisite lines of her face marred by the ugly purple bruise.
Did Damien ever tell you someone was trying to bribe him?
Good heavens, no! Bribe him to do what?
Spy on the other members of the delegation, perhaps.
You mean to work for the English? Damien would never have agreed to do such a thing. He was an honourable man, and fiercely loyal to France. He had no interest in money.
There are other ways of persuading a man to do things against his will.
By threats, you mean? She shook her head. Damien would never have allowed himself to be coerced into doing something dishonourable.
Even if the threats weren't against Damien himself, but against someone he loved.
Her gaze drifted back to her little brother, who had left his boats on the bank and was now following a waddling, complaining duck across winter-brown grass scattered with patches of melting snow. She swallowed hard, the silence filling with the rush of the wind, and the slap of the water against the shore, and the homely quack, quack of the duck. Sebastian said,
"Why did you decide to tell me about Vondroy now?"
She shook her head, as if unable or unwilling to put her motivation into words. And he was not cruel enough to do it for her. Armand Vondroy was sitting at a table in the coffee-room of the Gifford Arms when Sebastian walked in. An array of papers covered the surface before him. He had a quill in one hand, his head bent, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He cast Sebastian a quick glance, then returned to his work.
"The coffee-room is not open to the public,"
he said in his heavy Parisian accent. Sebastian went to stand with his back to the roaring fire.
"Good. Then we don't need to be worried about an interruption."
Vondroy grunted and dipped his pen in the small pot of ink at his elbow.
"How are the negotiations progressing?"
Sebastian asked pleasantly, as the Frenchman's quill scratched across his paper.
"Why don't you ask your father-in-law, or your own father, for that matter?"
Sebastian was careful to keep all signs of surprise off his face. But the truth was, he hadn't known until now that Hendon was also involved in the preliminary peace discussions. When he remained silent, Vondroy grunted again and said,
"Still determinedly chasing the illusion that Damien Pelletan was killed by someone other than a band of London's notorious footpads?"
"Something like that. Tell me, was Pelletan an ardent supporter of the Emperor Napoleon?"
"Dr. Pelletan was a dedicated physician. To my knowledge, he wasn't an ardent supporter of anyone."
"But he favoured peace."
"He did."
"And was he pleased with the direction the negotiations were taking?" Vondroy lifted his head in a way that enabled him to look at Sebastian over the upper rims of his spectacles.
"Damien Pelletan had no part in the negotiations."
"But he knew how they were progressing, did he not?"
"No."
"No?"
"No."
The Frenchman went back to his writing. Sebastian said,
"Did you know Damien Pelletan has a sister here in London?"
"I did, yes.
Now you really must excuse me. I'm very busy. Would you kindly go away and allow me to finish my work?"
"In a moment. Are you not even curious to know what happened to him?"
"I am a diplomat, not a policeman. The wrong kind of curiosity is a luxury I cannot afford. If Damien Pelletan's murderer must go free for the negotiations to continue, then so be it."
"I can understand that. But what if Pelletan was killed by someone intent on disrupting your mission? Surely it has occurred to you that the murderer might well try again, by targeting someone else in your party?" Vondroy dropped his pen, a splotch of ink flowing across the paper as his head came up. His gaze met Sebastian's across the room, then jerked away as footsteps sounded on the paving outside the inn's sashed windows. Sebastian heard a man's voice, followed by a woman's gentle laughter. It took him a moment to realize who it was. Then he saw Colonel Fouché walking side by side with Madeleine Quesnel, a market basket slung over her arm. And there was no disguising the raw fear that gusted across her father's face as he confronted a new and obviously terrifying possibility. A smothering envelope of dense fog was descending on the city, yellow and heavy with the bitter stench of coal smoke. Leaving the Gifford Arms, Sebastian turned toward the hackney stand at the end of York Street. It was only mid-afternoon, but the streets were unnaturally deserted, the pavement slick with condensation and grime, every sound magnified or distorted by the suffocating shroud of foul, heavy moisture. He could hear the rattle of a harness in the distance, the shouts of boatmen out on the river, and the steady rhythm of a man's footsteps that seemed to start up out of nowhere and gained on him fast. Chapter 36. Sebastian walked on, his senses suddenly intensely alert. The shadow's footsteps kept pace with him. He passed a gnarled old workman in a blue smock, his grey-bearded face beaded with moisture, his head bent as he hurried on without a second glance. A moment later came the thump of two bodies colliding, and the workman's angry, "Oi, why don't you watch where you're going?" The shadow's footsteps hesitated for an instant, then resumed and quickened. Sebastian stepped sideways, turning so that his back was to the brick wall of the townhouse beside him as he stopped and listened. Damn this fog! A man stepped out of the swirling mist, a gentleman, clad in a fashionable greatcoat and beaver hat, with a heavy scarf that obscured the lower part of his face. He held his left hand straight down at his side, the folds of his greatcoat all but obscuring the dagger clutched in his fist. "Looking for me?" said Sebastian. For one startled instant the man's gaze met Sebastian's, and his dark, heavily lashed eyes blinked as he realized just how radically the situation had suddenly altered. Not only had he lost the benefit of surprise, but it was considerably easier to knife a man in the back than to confront him face to face. Sebastian took a step forward. "What's the matter? Can't get at my back?" The would-be assailant turned and darted into the street. Sebastian leapt after him. A team of bay shires appeared out of the fog, heads bent as they leaned into their harnesses, the heavily loaded dray they pulled rattling over the uneven paving. The man drew up and spun around, his knife flashing just as Sebastian's foot slid on the wet stones. Before he could jerk out of the way, the blade slashed along Sebastian's forearm. Sebastian fought to regain his balance on the icy pavement, slipped, and went down hard. The man whirled and ran. "Bloody hell," swore Sebastian, scrambling to his feet, his bleeding arm held crimped to his chest. A whip cracked, the air filling with harsh shouts, and the jingle of harness as a wide-eyed pair of greys reared suddenly in the gloom. Sebastian ducked out of the way of the horse's slashing hooves, then swerved to dodge a lumbering dowager's carriage. By the time he reached the opposite footpath, the great-coated man in the heavy scarf had disappeared. "Your questions are obviously making someone uncomfortable," said Gibson, laying a neat row of stitches along the gash in Sebastian's arm. Sebastian grunted. "The question is, who?" He was seated on the table in Gibson's surgery, stripped to his waist, a glass of brandy cradled in his good right hand. Gibson tied off his thread. "Any chance Monsieur Armand Vondroy could have had his own physician killed?" "You mean because he discovered someone, probably Kilmartin, was trying to bribe Pelletan?" Sebastian took a slow swallow of his brandy. "It's certainly possible. It wouldn't matter whether or not Pelletan actually accepted Kilmartin's bribe, if Vondroy somehow came to hear of it. And there's no doubt in my mind that Vondroy is afraid of something.
I just don't know what. The other members of his delegation, perhaps? Perhaps. He remembered the horror Vondroy had shown when told the killer had removed Pelletan's heart. He still believed that horror was real. But it was always possible the Frenchman had simply been ignorant of his own henchman's viciousness. Sebastian watched Gibson smear a foul-smelling salve over the wound. What I find difficult to understand is why Vondroy or one of his associates would want to plant a charge of gunpowder in Golden Square in an effort to kill Damien Pelletan's sister. But then, that could be because Madame Sauvage is being considerably less honest with us than she could be. About a lot of things. He was aware of Gibson stiffening. What's that supposed to mean? I've discovered that Damien Pelletan was trying to convince Lord Peter Radcliffe's pretty young wife to run away with him. In fact, Pelletan and his sister were actually arguing about it just moments before he was murdered. Now, why do you suppose she neglected to tell us that? A woman's voice sounded from the doorway behind him. I've told you, there is much I still don't recall from that night. Sebastian turned to look at her. She wore the same old-fashioned gown from that morning, the smudges of black at her knees still visible from where she knelt beside the body of her dead servant woman. And it occurred to him that everything she owned had probably been lost in the explosion and fire. He glanced at Gibson, who was preparing to wrap a bandage around the injured arm. A faint but clearly discernible flush of colour rode high on the surgeon's gaunt cheekbones. And Sebastian knew without being told that Gibson had offered the now homeless Frenchwoman a place to stay. And she had accepted. He looked back at Madame Sauvage. How long had you known? That Damien wanted Julia to return with him to France? He only told me that night as we were walking up Cat's Hole to see Cécile. Did he tell you why? You mean that he had discovered Radcliffe was beating her? Yes. And it never occurred to you that a man violent enough to use his fists on his helpless young wife might also be violent enough to kill the man proposing to steal that wife away from him? I told you. I only learned what Damien intended the night of the attack. I simply did not recall it. Sebastian let his gaze drift over the pale, fine-boned features of her face. Not only was she a habitual liar, but she wasn't particularly good at it. How the hell Gibson couldn't see that was beyond him. But all he said was, "Tell me about your father's autopsy of the Dauphin in the Temple prison." The sudden shift in topic seemed to confuse her. She stared at him, her eyes wide. What? Your father was one of the doctors who performed an autopsy on Marie-Thérèse's 10-year-old brother, the Dauphin of France, after his death in prison. You were, how old? 12? 13? I was 14. So you must recall something about it. I take it you were already interested in medicine at the time. Surely he discussed it with you. He did. Did he believe the dead boy he saw in the temple was, in fact, the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette? She moved to stand before the room's fireplace, her back to them, her gaze on the small blaze on the hearth. My father saw the boy alive only once or twice, when he was called to the temple just days before the child's death. He never had any doubt that the boy who died in prison was that same child. Yet that's not to say the child he treated was actually the Dauphin. No, she said quietly. I've seen the autopsy report. My father kept a copy himself. It has been years since I read it, but I remember noticing that he was very careful to state that the body was identified by the jailers as belonging to the Dauphin. He himself did not make the identification. Did he believe the dead child actually was the Dauphin? I honestly do not know. It's not something he likes to talk about.
I do know he was confused because the jailers insisted to him that the child's final illness had come on suddenly. Yet the boy died of a long-standing case of tuberculosis.
Did he? Or was that simply the story that was put out? A fiction much less damning than to admit that he died of mistreatment or neglect.
No. My father told me the child whose body he autopsied most definitely died of tuberculosis. Sebastian looked at Gibson, who had his head bent, his attention seemingly all for the task of tying off the bandage. In the sudden hush, the buffeting of the wind against the heavy old windows and the creak of a cart's axle in the lane outside sounded unnaturally loud. Alexis Sauvage said, "What precisely are you suggesting? A moment ago you would have had me believe that Lord Peter Radcliffe killed my brother for coveting his wife. Now you're saying Damien's death is somehow linked to an autopsy my father performed nearly 20 years ago. Are you actually suggesting that the Dauphin somehow survived his imprisonment, and my father knew it? But that's absurd."
Is it?
It is, yes. My father must have believed the Dauphin died in the temple. Otherwise, why would he— She broke off, her chest jerking on a suddenly indrawn breath.
"What is it?" asked Sebastian, watching her. "Otherwise, why would he what?"
Her tongue crept out to slide across her cracked lower lip. At the conclusion of the autopsy, my father wrapped the boy's heart in his handkerchief and smuggled it out of the prison, hidden in the pocket of his coat. He soaked the heart in alcohol and has kept it preserved in a crystal vase in his office ever since."
"Are you telling me your father was the physician who removed the Dauphin's heart? And he still has it?"
"Yes."
"And you didn't tell us this. Why?"
Her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with scorn. "My father has performed hundreds of autopsies over the course of his career. It is preposterous to think that Damien's murder here, in London, is somehow linked to a death that occurred in Paris decades ago. My brother was killed because he was part of a delegation seeking a peace that is anathema to powerful interests here in England, both political and economic. Powerful interests that include your own father-in-law." Sebastian returned her hard stare.
"I might be able to accept that more easily if it weren't for one problem."
"What is that?"
"Why would Lord Jarvis, or anyone else involved in the peace negotiations for that matter, want to steal your brother's heart?"
Chapter 37. "Do you think Gibson is in love with Alexandre Sauvage?" Hero asked. It was after dinner, and they were seated in their drawing-room. Hero was petting the bored-looking black cat, while Sebastian, who saw no reason to follow the popular custom of drinking port in solitary splendour at his dining table, when he could be enjoying the company of his wife, held a glass of Burgundy. He was dressed in the silk knee-breeches, white stockings, and buckled shoes that were de rigueur for a gentleman attending a formal London function. It was the night of his Aunt Henrietta's musical soirée, and he had suddenly discovered a very good reason for attending. He took a slow swallow of his wine, for Hero's question had given voice to one of his own concerns.
"I'm very much afraid he might be."
"It could be good for him."
"Perhaps. If we were talking about any woman other than Alexis Sauvage."
"Maybe you're wrong about her." Across the room, her gaze met his, then dropped to the hand she moved slowly up and down the cat's back. "You don't need to tell me," she said quietly, her voice suddenly oddly scratchy, so that he wondered what she had seen in his face. He could hear the rattle of carriage wheels on the pavement outside, the whisper of ash falling on the hearth. The memory of that spring was like a frozen shiver across the skin, an incubus that stole his breath and tormented his soul. "No, I do. I should have told you before." He found he had to draw a deep breath before he could go on. "I met her 3 years ago, when I was serving as an observing officer for a vain, pompous, extraordinarily foolish and vindictive colonel named Sinclair Oliphant. Wellington's forces were already beginning to push into Spain, and Oliphant was in charge of securing the mountain passes out of Portugal. One day he ordered me to carry sealed dispatches to a band of partisans said to be camped in a small valley below the ancient convent of Santa Iria. Except it was all a hoax. Oliphant knew the partisans weren't there, and he'd had one of his spies tip off a French force operating in the area. They were waiting for me." Hero stared at him. "He deliberately had you captured? But why?" There was a large landowner in the area, Antonio Alvarez Cabral, who was refusing to cooperate with Oliphant. Alvarez Cabral wanted to make certain the French were gone for good before he'd risked throwing in his lot with the British. I didn't know it at the time, but the dispatches I carried were false. They were written specifically to fool the French into thinking the abbess of the convent of Santa Iria was in league with the partisans. Sebastian kept his gaze on his wine, glowing warm and red in the fire's light. The abbess was Alvarez Cabral's daughter. Hero's hand had stilled its rhythmic motion. Alexandre Sauvage was with the French forces? She was, although she was Alexis Beauclerc then. By that time her first husband had died, and she'd taken up with a French lieutenant named Tissot. So what happened? After he read the dispatches I'd carried, the French Major Rousseau rode off with some of his men. He was planning to torture me in the morning for whatever other information I might have, then kill me. But I managed to escape shortly before dawn, by killing Lieutenant Tissot. Alexis Sauvage's lover? Yes. There was more to the story, of course, much more, but he wasn't sure he was capable of talking about it. Still. Hero had the sensitivity not to press him. She said, "You think Alexis Sauvage would deliberately hurt Gibson, just to get back at you?" "I don't know. But my distrust of her motives doesn't stem only from what happened in Portugal. She's a beautiful young Frenchwoman who attended one of the best universities in Europe. Gibson is a one-legged Irish opium eater who learned everything he knows about surgery on the world's battlefields. He's a good man, he is. But I'm not convinced Alexandre Sauvage is the kind of woman to appreciate that. She keeps lying to us. About her father's theft of the Dauphin's heart, about her brother's intentions with Lady Peter, about the fact that Damien Pelletan even was her brother. Not telling you something isn't exactly the same as lying. It is in my book, at least when we're talking about murder. I can understand her lingering animosity toward you. But if she truly loved her brother, why be so secretive? I don't know. He glanced at the clock, set aside his wine, and rose to his feet. She rose with him, upsetting the disgruntled cat who arched his back and glared at Sebastian. I still can't believe you're going to ask Marie-Thérèse about her brother's heart in the middle of your Aunt Henrietta's soirée. Not Marie-Thérèse, Lady Giselle. I have it on excellent authority that Marie-Thérèse will never condescend to speak to me again, ever since I committed the unforgivable sin of daring to contradict her royal personage. It's one of the many hazards of believing in the divine right of kings. You start equating yourself with God, which means you see your enemies as not merely annoying or unpleasant, but the literal servants of Satan. What do you expect Lady Giselle to tell you? Nothing, actually. But I want to watch her face when I ask her whether or not Marie-Thérèse knows about the fate of the Dauphin's heart. Surely you don't think Marie-Thérèse killed Damien Peloton? Do I think she personally cut out his heart? No. She and Lady Giselle were closeted in prayer that night, remember? But I'd say she's more than capable of delegating the task to one of the hundreds of sycophants hanging around Hartwell House. But why? Why would she want the heart of a man whose only sin was that his father performed an autopsy on a dead child? Revenge? Malice? An exchange of missing body parts? I don't know. But the connection is there somewhere. I just haven't found it yet. London might still be thin of company, but virtually everyone who was anyone appeared to have decided to attend the Duchess of Claiborne's soirée that evening. As he pushed his way through the crowded reception rooms, Sebastian counted 2 royal dukes, a dozen ambassadors, and nearly enough peers to fill the House of Lords. The strains of one of Haydn's string quartets drifted through the cavernous townhouse. The rendition was exquisite, although no one really seemed to be listening to it. "Good God, Devlin!" exclaimed his aunt when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" She was looking regal in purple satin and the magnificent Claiborne diamonds, her grey head crowned by a towering purple velvet turban sporting an enormous diamond and pearl brooch. He bent to kiss her rouged and powdered cheek. "I was invited, remember? And you turned me down, twice. The only time you ever come to these things is when you want something." She regarded him through narrowed eyes. "What is it now?" He lifted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and smiled. "Who? In this case, it's definitely a who. The Duchesse d'Angoulême and her devoted companion, Lady Giselle Edmondson. They are here, I assume. Your soirée was given as one of their reasons for their removal to London, that, and the theatre. Although I'm told the latter is not such a draw, now that Miss Cat Boleyn has inexplicably chosen to absent herself this season." "Marie-Thérèse said that to you?" "She did. Nasty woman. I swear if she ever does become Queen of France, they'll have another revolution." "She is here, I take it?" "She is. I saw her go down to supper just moments ago. None of the Bourbons ever miss a chance at a free meal." He found Marie-Thérèse seated on one of the brocade-covered chairs lined up against the wall of the dining room, where a buffet of delicacies had been spread to tempt the jaded appetites of the guests. She wore an elegant gown of turquoise silk with a plunging neckline, designed to show off her mother's famous drop-pearl necklace. 3 white plumes nodded from the curls piled on her head, and she had a white ostrich plume fan she waved languidly back and forth, although it was not hot. He saw her stiffen, her gaze meeting his across the crowded room. Then she looked pointedly away. Smiling faintly, he walked up to where Lady Giselle was awkwardly endeavouring to fill 2 plates, one for herself and one for the princess. "Here, allow me to help you," he said, relieving her of one of the plates. "Thank you." She gave him a wry, almost conspiratorial smile. "I saw the look she threw you just now. You ought by rights to be dead on the floor." "I'm told she'll never forgive me. But you have." "I understand what you're trying to do. I can appreciate that, even admire it, however much I might disapprove of some of your methods." Sebastian's hand hovered over the nearest platters. "Crab and asparagus?" "Yes, please." He added them to the plate in his hand. She reached for a serving of shrimp in aspic. "You've obviously sought me out for a reason. What is it?" Sebastian studied her still faintly smiling profile. "Somehow I suspect you're not going to approve of what I have to say." She gave a soft laugh. "Shall I undertake not to throw this plate of food at your head?" "That might help. You see,
I've made a rather troubling discovery. It seems that not only did Damien Peloton's father perform an autopsy on the boy identified as the Dauphin, he also removed and carried away with him the child's heart. He still has it." She was no longer smiling. Her lips parted, two little white lines appearing at the corners of her mouth as her hand tightened so hard on the plate she held that he wondered it didn't crack. "I did not know that. Are you certain?" "If she were an actress, she was a world-class one." Sebastian said, "I'm told he keeps it in a crystal vase in his study." "Why would he do that?" She reached for a bread roll. "It has long been the practice in France to preserve the internal organs of the royal family separately from their bodies. The burial of the royals' remains typically took place at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, but their hearts and entrails were willed to various places. The previous Dauphin of France had his heart buried at Val-de-Grâce, along with those of scores of other kings and queens and princes of the blood." Sebastian wondered if she'd heard of the fate of those hearts during the Revolution. Their precious silver and gold reliquaries torn open and sent to the mint to be melted down. The hearts were put into a wheelbarrow and burned, except for a few that were sold to painters who liked to use the dried organs to create a special rare red-brown pigment known as mumia. He said, "So you're suggesting what? That Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan was a royalist? That he took the Dauphin's heart, so that even if his body were consigned to a common grave, his heart might at least be preserved?" "I don't know Dr. Pelletan's politics, but he has managed to hold on to his position at the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, through the Revolution, the Directory, and now Napoleon's empire. Whatever his opinions, he is obviously most adept at keeping them to himself." Sebastian glanced toward Marie-Therese, who sat rigidly staring at him with palpable dislike. He said, "Pelletan took a risk, preserving the heart of the child who died in the temple. He obviously believed the boy was indeed the Dauphin." "The rumors that the Dauphin somehow escaped the temple, but the boy who died in his place was an unfortunate deaf-mute impostor, are just that. Rumors. A myth. A tale told to comfort those unable to accept the harshness of reality." "Yet the rumors persist." "They do, yes. I will never understand why the revolutionaries failed to show Marie-Thérèse her brother's body. Perhaps after years of neglect and mistreatment, they feared she might not recognize him. Or perhaps they feared allowing her to see the state to which their cruelty had reduced him. But there is no doubt in my mind that the last son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette died in the temple in 1795. To suggest otherwise is as ridiculous as to lend credence to the silly tales of the Dark Countess." Sebastian shook his head, not understanding. "What Dark Countess?" Lady Giselle gave a small, tight laugh that held no real humour. "Ask Ambrose Lachapelle. I've no doubt he would enjoy telling you the story." She took the second plate from Sebastian's hand. "And now you must excuse me, my lord." "Thank you for your assistance." He watched her return to the princess's side and fuss about her with unfailing good humour. A few glances were thrown in his direction, but he had no doubt Lady Giselle was seriously editing her recital of their conversation. He went in search of Ambrose Lachapelle, but neither the French courtier nor the Comte de Provence was in attendance that night. Sebastian was just calling for his hat and cloak when a small, lithe figure in a tiger's striped waistcoat wiggled in through the crush, deftly evading all attempts to collar him. "Governor!" cried Tom, panting as he skidded to a halt. "Come quick!" Sebastian felt his stomach twist as he gripped the boy's slim shoulders. "What is it? Is it Lady Devlin?" "What? Oh, Lord, no. It's Sir Henry Lovejoy. He says to tell you that Frenchy colonel has been found dead,
on the Old Swan stairs. And wait till you hear what the killer done to him.
Chapter 38. What was left of Colonel André Fouché lay sprawled on his back halfway up, or halfway down, depending on one's perspective, the ancient slime-covered granite steps known as the Old Swan Stairs. Located at the base of Swan Lane, just above London Bridge, the stairs led from the lane down to the Thames. By day it was a busy landing point for the wherrymen and barges that plied the river, but at this hour of the night the river was deserted. A heavy, wet fog swirled around the body. The air was thick with the smell of the river and damp stone and death. His arms were thrown up on either side of his head, elbows slightly bent, palms toward the white sky. Sebastian took only one look at the man's face before turning away. Good God, what did they do to him? Sir Henry Lovejoy stood at the edge of the steps with his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his greatcoat. He had a scarf wrapped around his neck and held his shoulders hunched forward, although whether it was from the cold or the horror of what lay before him, Sebastian couldn't have said. The magistrate cleared his throat.
It appears someone has gouged out his eyes.
And his heart.
Oh, he still has that.
Sebastian squinted down the river toward the bridge, but the fog was so thick he couldn't even see 5 feet in front of his face. How did you even find him?
A wherryman tripped over him.
Has anyone spoken to Armand Vondroy?
Not exactly. The clerk, Camille Bondurant, identified the body. According to the constable who carried the news to the Gifford Arms, Monsieur Vondroy took the news quite badly. He's now dosed himself with laudanum and taken to his bed.
Lovejoy's disgust at this Gallic display of sensitivity flattened his face and quivered his nose, although he felt compelled to add, "I gather he has a bad heart." He thinks he does, at any rate.
Having 2 of your party of 5 murdered brutally is enough to give anyone a bad heart.
True. Sebastian hunkered down beside the murdered man and forced himself to take another look. A dark stain of blood spread out from beneath the body. How was he killed?
Stabbed in the back from the looks of things, but we'll know more when Gibson's had a go at him.
I wonder why the eyes, Sebastian said, half to himself.
It is rather symbolic, is it not? Rather like the theft of Pelletan's heart. Perhaps Fouché saw something he was not supposed to see.
Sebastian let out a long, troubled breath. In his arrogance he'd thought he was narrowing in on who had killed Damien Pelletan, and why. But Fouché's death, and more important, what had been done to him after death, suggested that the focus of Sebastian's inquiries so far had been all wrong. He pushed to his feet. "Have you heard anything about this morning's explosion in Golden Square?" Lovejoy nodded.
"I saw a preliminary report not long ago. It seems the rooms in which the charge was set were empty. The woman who previously occupied them died last week."
"Convenient. No one saw anything?"
"Apparently not. But there's no doubt that whoever set the blast knew what he was doing. I'm told the gunpowder was contained in such a way that the full force of the blast went upward."
"Toward Alexandre Sauvage's rooms?"
"Yes."
Sebastian brought his gaze back to the French colonel's ruined face. He'd become convinced that the theft of Damien Pelletan's heart was somehow connected to the reason for his murder. But Fouché's death complicated that scenario, even as it underscored his conviction that they were dealing with a killer who was either far from sane or else diabolically clever. Or perhaps both. The problem was, how did that morning's attempt on the life of Alexis Sauvage fit into any of it?
"Nothing symbolic about trying to blow someone up," he said aloud.
Lovejoy swallowed.
"If there is, I don't see it."
Sebastian nodded and started up the stairs,
the soles of his dress shoes slipping on the wet, slimy stones. Then he paused to look back as a thought occurred to him. What was Fouché doing here, anyway? That we don't know. Monsieur Vondroy picked a damned inconvenient time to dose himself with laudanum. Perhaps he'll have developed more of a stiff upper lip by tomorrow. One can only hope, said Sebastian. Wednesday, 27th of January. The next morning, Charles, Lord Jarvis, was still in his dressing room when he heard someone ringing an impertinent peal at the distant front door. He pulled on an exquisite pair of unmentionables and calmly buttoned the flap. His valet's head jerked around, eyes widening at the sound of a shout, followed by a light, quick step on the stairs. Jarvis said, "From the sound of things, I shall shortly be receiving a visitor. You may leave us." "Yes, my lord." The valet bowed and moved toward the door just as the handle turned and Viscount Devlin walked into the room. "Oh, good," said Devlin. "You're still here." He was dressed in doeskin breeches, tall hessians, and a black coat, and he brought with him all the smells of a foggy London. Jarvis wrinkled his nose and reached for a starched white cravat. "As you see." Devlin shut the door in the interested valet's face. "I take it you've heard about Colonel Fouché." "I have." He was aware of Devlin studying him, those ungodly yellow eyes glowing with a fierce passion. "Is it you? Is this all part of some diabolical scheme to frighten Armand Vondroy into fleeing back across the Channel?" "By plucking out the hearts and eyes of his underlings. How revoltingly Gothic. What do you suggest I do next? Eliminate the clerk, what's his name?" "Bonderon." "By having his tongue cut out?" "If anyone's capable of it, you are." Jarvis laughed. "Thank you. Or was that meant as an insult?" He carefully settled the wide strip of linen around his neck. "While I've no doubt such a simple solution would appeal to you, the fact remains that it is not I. Nor do I know who is doing this. But I won't pretend to be even vaguely troubled by the turn of events. If Vondroy is still in London by the end of the week, I'll be very much surprised." Devlin stood with his legs braced wide, his head thrown back, his jaw set hard. "Yet you would have had me believe you were concerned my inquiries might disrupt the progress of the negotiations." "I was concerned," Jarvis smiled, "if not quite for the reasons I'd led you to believe." "Would peace with France really be so bad? As long as Napoleon still rules as emperor? Yes." "Who would you have in his place? The Comte de Provence?" "For a time. He is next in line, after all, and one must at least appear to observe the traditional order of succession. Provence is a fool, and ridiculously infatuated with the more extreme permutations of constitutional monarchy. But he's old before his time and hopelessly fat. He won't last long." "And then what? His brother Artois? The man is a dangerous reactionary, as well as being foolish and vain and hopelessly profligate. The French would never put up with him for long." "I think perhaps you underestimate Artois's enthusiasm for repression. He watched the mistakes his brother Louis XVI made back in 1789, giving in to one demand after the next, when a few well-placed whiffs of grape-shot would have scuttled the entire revolution before it had a chance to gain momentum." Devlin remained silent. After a moment, Jarvis smiled. "You know, of course, that I've had men watching the French delegation since their arrival." "I didn't know, but I can't say I'm exactly surprised. Would you have me believe they observed something useful?" "As to its usefulness, that is not for me to say. But I do know they witnessed an interesting quarrel between Damien Pelletan and his sister on the night he died." The Viscount's eyes narrowed. "You knew Alexandre Sauvage was Pelletan's sister?" Jarvis kept his gaze on the mirror, his fingers adjusting the folds of his cravat. Devlin said,
"Where precisely did this quarrel occur?" "At the Gifford Arms. I'm told that a man and a woman arrived first. They spoke to Peloton for a time, and then retired. Madame Sauvage appeared just as Peloton was about to return to the inn." "You're not telling me anything I don't know." "Really? How industrious of you. Only, I gather, you somehow neglected to hear of the quarrel which then took place." "And what precisely was the subject of this quarrel?" "That, my informant, was too far away to hear." "Then how did he know it was a quarrel?" "It was rather heated. There was no mistaking the level of passion involved." "And the man and woman who came before, who were they?" "My observer was unable to make an identification." "Indeed." Jarvis smiled at the Viscount's posture of stiff incredulity. "Yes, indeed." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because this obsession of yours with the death of Damien Peloton is becoming tiresome. You belong at home with your pregnant wife. Hero is fine. Believe me, she wouldn't thank you for encouraging me to hover anxiously about her." Jarvis smoothed the line of his waistcoat, his gaze hard on his son-in-law's face. "If my daughter dies because of the babe you planted in her belly, I swear to God I will kill you. Personally." Devlin's gaze met his and held it, and Jarvis saw there a deep and quiet awareness of the looming danger to Hero that Jarvis realized matched his own. "She's not going to die." Chapter 39. Alexandre Sauvage answered Sebastian's knock at the door of Gibson's surgery on Tower Hill. "Gibson is in the yard, performing the autopsy on Colonel Fouché," she said. "Good." Sebastian brushed past her when she would have shut the door again. "You're the person I wanted to see." She stood for a moment with one hand on the latch, the fog creeping in around them. Then she closed the door and turned to face him. "What do you want?" She wore the only dress she now possessed, although she had fastened an apron over it. The apron was liberally smudged with grime, and there was a dirty streak across one cheek. He realized she'd been scrubbing the small room to the right of the door, making it her own. He should have been relieved to discover that she was staying in the surgery rather than in Gibson's house. Only he wasn't sure it made much of a difference. He said, "You told me that the night Damien Peloton was killed, you went to the Gifford Arms and found him standing in front of the inn." "Yes," she said slowly, as if mistrusting where his questions were leading. "What exactly did you say to him?" "There's a sick child I'd like you to look at. Please come." "Something like that, yes." "Nothing else?" "And then you left for St. Catherine's?" "Yes." "And as you walked up Cat's Hole, he told you he wanted Lady Peter to run away with him, and you quarrelled?" "Yes." She stared back at him, her brown eyes dark with suspicion, and what looked very much like hate. He said, "So what did you argue about at the Gifford Arms? Given everything I've learned about Damien Peloton, I find it difficult to believe you had to work to convince him to come with you. So what the devil were you quarrelling about?" "Who told you we argued at the inn?" "Damien was part of a French delegation sent to London on a delicate mission. It's hardly to be wondered at that he was being watched." "By Jarvis, you mean?" When Sebastian didn't say anything, she huffed a scornful, breathy laugh. "What exactly are you suggesting? That I quarrelled with my brother, lured him into a dark alley, cut out his heart, and then hit myself over the head? Oh, and then blew up my servant woman when she threatened to expose my evil deeds to the world?" Bright colour appeared high on her cheeks. "I am a doctor. I save lives.
I do not take them." It had, in fact, occurred to him that she might be far more involved in her own brother's death than she would like them to believe. But all he said was, "The argument at the inn, what was it about?" She shook her head. "I can't tell you. It involves a secret that is not mine to reveal." Sebastian stared at her. "What the devil do you think I'm going to do? Shout it from the rooftops? Take out an advertisement in the Times? God damn you, 3 people are already dead. How many more must die before you start being honest with me? Tell me what the bloody argument was about." She went to stand at the narrow window overlooking the lane, but the fog was so thick it was like trying to look through yellow soup. She said, "Damien had discovered that I knew something, that I'd known it for 9 years. Something he believed I should have told him. I'm sorry, but more than that I cannot say." "For 9 years? 9 years?" "Bloody hell," said Sebastian. He was seeing a blond, green-eyed boy sailing 2 painted wooden boats across the water, while his sister watched him with a mother's intense love and pride. "It's Noel Durand, isn't it? The boy isn't Lady Peter's brother. He's her son, by Damien P.2. She turned to stare at him, her face slack with astonishment. "You knew?" He shook his head. "No. I'd assumed P.2 came to London because he'd somehow learned of Lord Peter's treatment of his wife. But he came because of the boy, didn't he? How did he ever happen to learn the truth?" "From an old priest whose deathbed he attended in Paris. The priest was delirious. At first Damien thought he was only rambling nonsense, except the more he heard, the more the old man's words came to make sense. Julia Durand knew she was with child before she left Paris." "She did?" "Yes." "Then why the hell didn't she tell the man she claimed to love?" "Because she was 16. Because she was afraid. Because her father had assured her the family's flight from France would be temporary. Only it wasn't." "And so she found herself a refugee in London," Sebastian said softly, "unwed, and growing increasingly heavy with child. The poor girl." Alexandre Sauvage nodded. Once the general and his wife realized what was happening, they kept Julia out of sight. They knew that if the truth ever became known, she would be hopelessly ruined. Madame Durand was young enough to pretend to be with child herself. I'm told she even went so far as to strap a pillow to her belly when she appeared in public. In due time the child was born, and presented as General Durand's son. He had no other children. 2 older sons. Both died, fighting Napoleon. Sebastian had always wondered why the aging French general married his only daughter to a man like Lord Peter Radcliffe. Yes, Radcliffe was a duke's son, handsome and brilliantly connected. But a general with Durand's experience with men must surely have seen his son-in-law for the vain, self-absorbed dissolute he was. Now it all made sense. Sebastian said, "Does Radcliffe know?" "About Noel, you mean?" "I'm not certain." "Yet you knew." "Julia told me before she left Paris. She told me in confidence, and I swore I'd never tell anyone." "Did P.2 know Radcliffe beats her?" "Before he came? No. But it didn't take him long to figure it out. That's when he tried to convince her to go back to Paris with him, for her sake as well as for the boys." "How did he discover you'd been aware of the child all along?" "Something Julia said to him. He was furious. I tried to make him understand that it was a secret told to me in confidence. How could I have betrayed it? But he wouldn't listen."
Yet he went with you to St. Catherine's to see the sick child.
Damien was a physician. He would never put his own personal emotions ahead of the well-being of a patient. He went with me, but he was in a passion. We were still arguing about it after we left Hangman's Court. Sebastian studied her tightly held features. It explained why, if someone were following them, they hadn't heard the footsteps until it was too late. But while it might believably give Lord Peter Radcliffe a stronger reason to kill his wife's former lover, it did nothing to explain the deaths of either Carmela or Colonel Fouché. He said,
"Do you think Lady Peter was still in love with Damien?"
"I think she was, yes."
"Yet she was reluctant to return with him to Paris?"
"She said she'd made a commitment to Lord Peter, a commitment she couldn't go back on."
"Despite the fact he beat her?"
"I've known women to make excuses for men who beat them so badly they died."
"You mean like Abel Bullock's wife?"
"Yes." Sebastian studied her calm, proud face. She was the kind of woman who had long ago turned her back on society's expectations for one of her sex. She had studied medicine at an Italian university and joined her physician husband in following Napoleon's Grand Army, and when he died, she'd taken a lieutenant as her lover and continued ministering to the medical needs of the soldiers. How she had then ended up with an English captain as her husband, Sebastian could only guess. But the realization that Gibson was falling daily more and more under her spell twisted at Sebastian's guts and made him want to shake some sense into his friend. He said,
"Why are you here? I mean here, at Gibson's."
He expected her to deliberately misunderstand his question, to make excuses, and claim the need for a place of refuge. Instead, she said, "Someone needs to help him."
"Gibson? He's doing fine. Or at least he was."
"Before you came into his life. If you mean he was doing a fine job of killing himself, you are right. Do you have any idea what long-term use of opium does to the human body, especially at the levels at which he has been taking it?"
"He doesn't go overboard that often."
"How do you know?" Sebastian opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, he'd seen little of Gibson these past 4 months or more. He said,
"The man is in pain. How do you expect him to live with that?"
"I can help him with the pain, if he will only let me."
"The way you helped the children and nuns of Santa Maria."
Her head jerked back as if he'd slapped her. "I didn't know."
"Yes, you did. You knew. And you let it happen."
Her voice was a harsh tear. "If the blood of those children is on my hands, it's on yours too."
"Yes. The difference between you and me is that I've never denied it."
She stared back at him, and the death-haunted memories of that long-ago Portuguese spring were like a hushed presence in the room with them. He said,
"Paul Gibson is my friend. I won't let you destroy him."
"Destroy him?" She gave a ringing laugh. "What in God's name do you think I'm going to do to him? Pluck out his heart and his soul?"
"How many husbands and lovers have you had? How many are still alive?"
She didn't answer, but the flesh of her face pulled taut across the bones, and her eyes darkened with the power of some emotion he couldn't quite define. He settled his hat on his head and turned toward the door. He was about to close it behind him when she took a quick step forward, one hand fisted in her grimy apron, the other coming up to thrust back the lock of vibrant hair that had tumbled onto her forehead. "4. I've had 4. 2 lovers, 2 husbands. And you are right. All are dead. And all but the last were killed by Englishmen." She practically spat the last word at him.
"What happened to the last one?" he asked. What happened to Captain Miles Sauvage?
But she simply wrenched the door from his grip and slammed it in his face. Chapter 40. Gibson was leaning against the slab in the centre of the small stone outbuilding at the base of the yard, his arms smeared with gore up to the elbows, when Sebastian came to stand in the entrance. What was left of Colonel André Fouché lay face up on the slab, his body naked and eviscerated, his ruined eyes hideous in the glare of the lantern Gibson had lit against the morning gloom.
"Ah, there you are," said the surgeon, laying aside his scalpel and reaching for a rag to wipe his hands. "There's something I wanted you to see. Here, help me turn him over." Between them they eased the French colonel over to reveal the back of his long, slim torso. The purple slit low between his shoulder blades was clearly visible. "So he was stabbed," said Sebastian. "He was indeed, with a dagger. And here's something interesting. Judging by the angle of the blade's entry, I'd say it's a good bet that the man who stabbed him is not right-handed. I could be wrong, mind you. It's always possible the killer was standing in such a way as to have the same effect. But it's far more likely you're looking for a left-handed murderer. I just wish I'd had Pelleton's body long enough to know if he was stabbed in the same way. The man who tried to kill me twice is left-handed." Sebastian studied the freshly healed scar running the length of the colonel's right arm. "Doesn't seem right, somehow, for him to have managed to survive Napoleon's debacle in Russia, only to be stabbed in the back in London. Bit ironic, that's for sure. You can bet he didn't see this as a dangerous assignment." Gibson paused. "Know if he had any family?" Sebastian shook his head. "I never asked." Together they turned the corpse again, and Sebastian found he had to look away from that ravaged face. "What can you tell me about the damage to his eyes?" "I suspect whoever knifed him in the back then took his dagger to the eyes. It's very crudely done. Like Pelleton's heart." Sebastian rubbed his own eyes with a splayed thumb and forefinger, then wiped his hand down over the lower part of his face. "Any idea why he was killed?" Gibson asked. "I've lots of ideas. The problem is figuring out which of them is right. He could have been killed by someone intent on disrupting the peace negotiations. Or he could have died because he knew something about what happened to Pelleton." Gibson wiped his hands again and reached for his scalpel. "I'm not quite finished here, but I'd be surprised if there's anything more to be learned." Sebastian started to turn toward the door, then paused to say, "I spoke to Alexis Sauvage just now." "Oh?" said Gibson, without looking up. "She tells me Lady Peter's young brother is actually her son, by Damien Pelleton. Did you know?" Gibson shook his head. "No. She says she was told about the child in confidence, and felt honour-bound to keep Lady Peter's secret. But I think that's not the only thing she's still holding back from us." "She's very frightened." She didn't strike Sebastian as frightened, but all he said was, "I hope you know what you're doing." Gibson looked up then, his green eyes glinting. "What the devil is that supposed to mean?" "You know." But Gibson only ducked his head again, a flush of anger or chagrin riding high on his gaunt cheeks.